So tonight I have two stories to tell you, and they're great stories. But when I was thinking about how I would go about teasing the stories, like I do at the top of these episodes, I couldn't quite think of sort of what the connective tissue was between them. But then I realized really what makes these stories exceptional is that they're both just excellent stories, as I'm getting hit by the heat of this fire, to be told around a campfire. But before we get into those two stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right campfire, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, go ahead and invite the follow button to come to your campfire to cook some s'mores with you. But give them the wrong date and location. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into tonight's stories. In the late 1990s, in rural New York, there were these two teenage girls named Rachel and Molly, and they were both very good friends. They were part of a bigger group of friends in their high school that sort of spent a lot of time together, but Rachel and Molly oftentimes were together by themselves quite a bit. And the thing that sort of drew the two together and really sort of made them friends in the first place and also drew them to that bigger group was their shared love of goth culture. So being goth, especially in the late 90s and early 2000s, if you were like a high school kid, basically meant you wore all black clothes, you had like black, nail polish, black lipstick, your hair's black, you sort of embraced all things dark and macabre. Some people were genuinely very into sort of like the idea of embracing the dark side of things. Other people just did it as like a fashion statement. But in the late 1990s and early 2000s, it was definitely a thing, certainly in America. And Rachel and Molly were both very committed goths, and they just sort of loved that whole vibe. And one of the things that Rachel and Molly really liked to do as goth teenagers is they and their group of friends would go hang out in the local cemetery. Now, at first, the reason they did this was actually to sort of be ironic. It's like they were known as the goth kids in their high school, and so the idea of them hanging out in a cemetery just seemed kind of too on the nose. And so they went out there almost like a joke, the whole group of them. But they found the cemetery was kind of a cool hangout spot, and they began to really enjoy hanging out in the cemetery, and it became sort of like their go-to thing, especially on the weekends. Now, typically when Rachel, Molly, and their friends would go hang out in the cemetery, they would do so at night to sort of maximize, the darkness, really leaning into the whole goth side of things. But also, they would always go as a group. Like it was Rachel, Molly, and several other people that would be in the cemetery hanging out at one time. Like Rachel and Molly did not go there just the two of them. It was always a group. And part of the reason was it was just more enjoyable that way. But also, despite their love of spending time in the cemetery, it was still a cemetery at night, and it was, a little bit creepy. And so there was, strength in numbers, and so they liked being there with a group. It felt safer. One Friday night, Rachel was home alone when she got a call from Molly. And Molly asked her, hey, do you want to go hang out in the cemetery? And Rachel's like, duh, like, that's what we do on the weekends. I'd love to go. Like, come pick me up. Let's go. And so Rachel, she gets all ready and, she's waiting outside. And eventually Molly shows up in her car. And the first thing Rachel notices is that Molly's all alone in the car. She is not with the group that normally she would be with when they picked Rachel up. So Rachel, she walks out to the car and she climbs in and she says to Molly, like, hey, so are we now going to pick up the rest of our friends? Like, where is everybody? And Molly's like, actually, no, I tried getting in touch with everybody else, but everybody's either busy or working or hungover from last night. So it's just going to be us two at the cemetery. Like, is that okay? And Rachel admittedly did not think this was okay. Because again, like this was not an activity that these girls did by themselves. Rachel was very close with Molly and vice versa. Like that was fine. It's a little uncomfortable being in the cemetery without the big group. But, Rachel didn't want to be rude. She sort of felt like Molly had already clearly made peace with them being alone out there. And so Rachel's like, Oh yeah, that's fine. Like, it'll be great, just the two of us. Like, let's go. And so even though she sort of didn't want to, she gets in the car and they take off and they drive, the half mile to the cemetery. Now, this cemetery was enormous. It was like this massive, very old cemetery. And when you pull up to it, as they did in their car, you would first see this huge, like medieval gate, like this archway that sort of goes across the entrance to the cemetery. And like the big wrought iron gates, they're sort of permanently open, but it's this very like sort of Gothic looking, archway that you drive through. And then once you're in the cemetery, the road you're on basically cuts down the very middle of the cemetery all the way to the backside. It's a huge, probably like over a mile from one side to the other. And it sort of split the cemetery into two big parts, the right and the left side as you go in. And where they, Molly, Rachel, and their friends loved to hang out was sort of, as you're driving into the cemetery, like the back left corner. And the reason they liked that area is because on the left side of the cemetery, sort of on the left-hand side, there were sort of like rolling hills that all the plots were in. And in particular, in the back left corner of the cemetery, there was like this one depression in the earth where there really weren't that many tombstones. And there was like a big boulder sitting at the bottom of the depression and a tree that was next to it. And so basically, if you were scanning across the top of the cemetery, just from the gate, looking out at the entire expanse of land, anybody that was down in that sort of depressed area in the back left corner, you basically couldn't see them. They're sort of tucked away down there with the rock and the tree. And so for, teenagers, for Rachel, Molly, and their friends, that was like a great place to hang out and kind of be away from the prying eyes of the public. And so, Rachel and Molly, they drive through this gate and they make the familiar drive right down the middle of this road all the way to the very back of the cemetery. By this point, it is getting dark outside. It's not totally dark yet, but it's pretty dark. Nobody's out at the cemetery. No one really ever was. Occasionally on the other side of the cemetery, basically on the exact opposite side from where they would hang out, sometimes the college kids that were in town, there was a university in their town, they would sometimes hop the fence on the other side, and there was like a little bonfire section, like right up against the fence in the cemetery. Totally not allowed, but they would sneak over and do that sometimes. But that was sort of rare. But other than those occasional college students over there, the cemetery was basically always vacant. And so they get to the other side, they park their car, they get out, and they walk right from the road, basically right down this it's a gentle sloping hill, but down into this depression, their hangout spot. And once they get down there, there's that big rock and the tree, and they each took up positions sitting on the rock, leaning against the tree, and then just began crushing cigarettes and just hanging out, because that's what goth teenagers in rural New York in the 1990s did. So Rachel and Molly, they're doing their thing. They're having a nice time. They're swapping stories. They're talking about their boyfriends, about drama at school, and eventually it gets fully dark outside, and the girls are still just having a nice time. And Rachel's actually thinking to herself, like, actually, this is kind of nice. Like, this isn't scary. This is kind of cool. Like, I'm having good one-on-one time with my buddy here. But eventually, as they're down there, they start to smell smoke. Now, remember, periodically, on the other side of the cemetery, like pretty far away, was that bonfire area that college kids sometimes would, start bonfires over there. And, when Rachel and Molly had first come into the cemetery, they had looked over there and hadn't seen a fire. But they're thinking, we've been hanging out here for quite a while. It's entirely possible that in the time we've been down here, that those kids have hopped the fence, started a fire, and that's what we're smelling. Now, the fire itself really had no bearing directly on whatever Molly and Rachel were going to do that night. I mean, they're on opposite sides of the cemetery. But Rachel and Molly knew that historically, whenever there was a bonfire over there, eventually the police would always show up, because you're not allowed to do that. And they would kick off, the kids, they'd make them put their fire out. And then always the police would do, a check of the entire cemetery. And anybody that was hanging out in there, like Molly and Rachel were, also got kicked out, even if they were not starting fires. And so Molly and Rachel, they look at each other after smelling this fire, and they both sort of have the same thought, like, we should probably just leave, before the police get here and make us leave. And, after all, they'd been there for quite a while. They were about ready to leave anyhow, so this was like no big deal. So, they put out their last cigarette, they got their stuff, and they turned and began walking back up the hill, back in the direction they had come down on, back in the direction of their car. And as they're walking up, they're expecting to crest the hill and, see their car and see the whole cemetery and, maybe way off in the distance, maybe they'll see a flicker of the bonfire that they must be smelling. But as they walk up and they see their car and they look out across the cemetery, they don't see a fire over there. Instead, basically right over to their right, 100 meters away from them, was another sort of depression in the cemetery, another rolling hill that sort of went down out of sight. And they could see basically the tops of a flickering fire, in the neighboring depression, 100 meters away. Now, when they showed up, they were definitely alone on this side of the cemetery. There was nobody else here. And so clearly someone has shown up and started a fire while they were here. And they've never seen any behavior like this. This is completely unusual. No one starts fires over here. What is that? So the two girls they're curious. Did the college kids come over here to start a fire? Because again, they can only see the tops of the flames of this fire down in this neighboring depression. They can't see the person or people who are around it, but they're thinking the people over there have no idea that we are over here. And so the two girls are well, what if we kind of go back down to where we were and sneak up the far side of our sort of hilled in area and poke our heads over and see whose fire this is. We'll see the college kids and see what they're doing. We can spy on them or something. And the two girls are why not? We're already here. And so the two girls, they turn around, they walk back down into the base of their depression where the big rock and the tree was that they were just sitting on for the past couple of hours. And they walk past it basically to the other side and begin walking up that hill. And as they're getting closer and closer to the top of this hill, when eventually, once they reach the top, they could peer over and see the fire and see whoever was there. Right as they got almost to the top, Rachel sort of unintentionally makes some noise, the way she was walking, and she sort of made a sound as she stepped on something, but she accidentally makes a fair amount of noise. And the only noise in the area was the sound of the fire. They hadn't heard any voices yet. And so Rachel, she just covers her mouth and looks over at Molly, and Molly kind of looked at her what are you doing? We're sneaking up on these people. Why are you making noise? And the two girls, they just freeze for a second, waiting to see if, whoever was over there heard them and sort of reacted to the noise Rachel made. But it was silent, sort of eerily silent. And at this point, Rachel and Molly, it was the mood just shifted. They had not reached the top of the hill yet. They had not seen whoever was at this fire. But it was something just felt wrong now. And the two girls looked at each other and they're maybe we should just turn around and leave. And they both were yeah, let's get out of here. This doesn't feel right. And so right then and there, the two girls, as quietly as they could, turned and retreated back down to the center of the depression where the rock and the tree was, and they begin walking back up the original side of the hill in the direction of where their car is parked at the top. And as they're walking up, Rachel just happens to turn back around where they had just been, just to look in the direction of where they had just been. And now she sees there is clearly a man standing on the ridgeline with the fire behind him, illuminating him, and he's just standing there sort of ominously staring in the direction of Rachel and Molly. And he's just not saying a word, he's just looking in their direction. Clearly he was the one over at the fire, he must have heard them. And Rachel, she whips around and she's Molly, look. And Molly looks and she's let's get out of here. We don't know who that guy is, we gotta get out of here. And so Rachel and Molly, they begin quickly walking up the hill. And then a second later, Rachel turns back around and the man is no longer on the hill, but then she sees movement and she realizes he's running down the hill in their direction. And so the girls start screaming, they start running up the hill. Rachel's constantly looking around and this guy's gaining on them. They get to the top of the hill, they charge over to Molly's car, they jump inside, they lock the doors, they fire it up and they drive off. And as they're driving, Rachel's looking out the back window and she sees this man basically looking. He's reached the road, he almost got to them. And he was looking in their direction, and as they drove off, he just slowly turned and walked back down the hill out of sight. And so Rachel and Molly, they're totally shaken up by this. Clearly that wasn't a college kid. That was a 40-something-year-old man who they had never seen before. The whole situation just felt totally just creepy and spooky, and they really didn't know what to make of it. They sort of felt like what could have happened if he reached us? What was he trying to do? What just happened? But ultimately, when they got home, or when Molly dropped Rachel off at her house, the two girls were sort of like, man, that was crazy, huh? They kind of like chalked it up as like just a crazy night, like, oh boy, we better, stay out of there alone at night, like it was just sort of a joke by the time they were done for the night. And so Rachel, she goes into her house, doesn't even tell her mom. She just, puts her stuff down, goes to her room, and Molly, she went to her house, and she too didn't even tell anyone. She went to bed as well. The next morning, Rachel woke up and she went downstairs into the kitchen, and her mom was in there. And her mom was just kind of doing her morning routine. And when she saw Rachel come in, she said to Rachel, like, hey, how was your night last night? And Rachel was like, oh, it was fine. Me and Molly went out. It was fine. No big deal. And her mom was like, oh, did you hear what happened last night? And Rachel's like, no, what do you mean? What happened? And her mom was like, well, a woman in our town got kidnapped. And she got kidnapped from the very parking garage where I park. Like, she worked in the same building as me. She got kidnapped. And Rachel's like, oh my God, like, what happened to her? Like, did they find her? And Rachel's mom is like, no. Unfortunately, it was too late. When they found her, she was dead. And in fact, whoever kidnapped and then killed her brought her body last night to the local cemetery and burned her in this huge bonfire. And whoever did it still hasn't been caught. And when Rachel heard this, it was like her whole world came crashing down, because suddenly she understood what had happened the night before. That fire was no ordinary fire. That was the killer that chased them down the hill. That fire very likely contained the woman who had been killed. They were right next to this person, this killer, and this horrible thing happening. And even more creepy is, like, they were there very likely when the killer arrived, set up shop, and began burning this body, no more than 100 meters away from them. And what would have happened if that man who chased them, what would have happened if he caught them? And so Rachel, she pours her heart out to her mom and tells her everything that happened the night before. And her mom is like, oh my God, I can't believe this happened. You have to tell the police, because they haven't caught this guy. Like, you have a description of him. Like, go talk to the police. And so sure enough, Rachel, she gets in touch with Molly and, tells Molly what happened. And Molly's totally in hysterics. They can't believe what a close call this was. And they do go to the police. They tell them, to the best of their ability, what they remember about this guy, which unfortunately was not much. It was like, he was average height, he looked to be maybe in his 40s. Like, there wasn't much to their description. But fortunately, just 48 hours later, the police were able to catch this guy, and he would make a full confession. Luckily, 2 days later, not really because of the girl's description at all, but just sort of by luck alone, the police happened to see the victim's car in town. Somebody was driving the victim's car around, and so they pulled this person over. It wound up being the killer, who, after being arrested, did make a full confession. And so, needless to say, Rachel and Molly, when they think about what happened that night in the cemetery, they feel very fortunate that Rachel sort of inadvertently made noise on their approach to go spy on the fire, which ultimately caused them both to sort of rethink their decisions and turn around and leave. It very likely saved their life. Because if that hadn't happened, and they had gone over the hill and had been confronted by the killer, it's entirely possible that both those girls could have wound up in the bonfire as well. So before I became MrBallen and, told stories on the internet, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, I was in the military. I was a Navy SEAL for 7 years. And there was a time where I believed that was going to be my calling in life. But I ultimately got hurt, and honestly, it wasn't really a fit. So I wound up departing, and then obviously the rest is history. I became MrBallen. But, I have lots of stories about my time when I was in the military. I have lots of really funny stories about training and scary stories, about my actual service overseas. But one story that has always stood out to me was actually what it was like to deploy for the very first time to Afghanistan. And this is not really a war story, and that's why this story sort of stands out to me. So, I spend years, literally almost 3 years, training and becoming a Navy SEAL. And then it's like, okay, I get to my SEAL team on the East Coast in Virginia, and so SEAL Team 2 is where I was, and we start training for our deployment, and we find out it's going to be to Afghanistan, and this is back in 2013, and so going to Afghanistan likely meant combat. in that time, there was still definitely active combat operations happening. And for Navy SEALs and for any direct combat unit, you do want to go to war, not because you are like a warmonger, but because that's what you train for. And so it's like, okay, like I'm getting ready for combat. And then the day comes, and the way you deploy this is not unique to Navy SEALs, but like they don't send you out to wherever you're going in one group because it's sort of risky. What if a plane crashes and your whole platoon gets wiped out, right? So you get sent out in like little batches, like sometimes on civilian flights. Like I flew first to South America with like a couple other SEALs. We're all dressed as civilians. And then we hitched a military transit flight actually into Afghanistan. But again, like my mentality as I'm getting ready for this deployment is like, okay, like this is the thing I've trained for. Like, here we go, like combat. And I remember I was on this military plane. This is the last leg actually getting into Afghanistan. And when we actually flew into Afghani airspace, which is an active war zone at the time, the pilots, the military pilots, they turned the lights inside of the aircraft from the white overhead, daytime lights to red. And then they told all of us to stay away from the windows. And the reason was like, we're now entering, the part of this trip where we're going to land. And in theory, the plane could get shot at. You don't want to get shot at through the window. And I mean, if you think about it, if you're getting blasted by like an RPG, it's not going to matter that like you're near a window or not. But it was sort of this stark reminder that it's like, okay, here we go. Like we're about to enter a war zone. And then the way these planes would land is they needed to basically cut down the amount of time they were within small arms range. So the lower you get, the more, sort of exposed the plane is. And so the way they'd land is they would take these really steep descents and basically like fly straight down and then land really abruptly. It was like sort of gnarly. And so we're coming in for this crazy landing. The red lights are on. Everyone's tucked away from the windows. And I'm like, okay, we're getting ready for Afghanistan. And we touch down. And it's a successful landing, and now we're in this like pretty well fortified base. Shank is what it was called. And I remember the back of the plane opened up after we sort of had stopped taxiing. We came to a stop, and the back of the plane opened up. And remember, my mentality is like, okay, we're going to war, right? And I grabbed my pack. The rest of my stuff had been packed on pallets and sent weeks prior. So all I have is a backpack. And me and a buddy of mine, another guy on my team, we walk out the runway, and we basically see Afghanistan really for the first time, because I really had the windows on the airplane, by the way, were like these little portholes. You really never got a good look, not to mention we had to avoid the windows. So this is like my first view of Afghanistan. And I remember just like looking around, and it was just unbelievably beautiful. Like Afghanistan is shockingly beautiful. It's in every direction, 360 degrees, these just enormous, like massive snow-covered mountains and just beautiful fields. It's like untouched land. And like we're in the middle of this like jagged scar across the earth, which is this like NATO base where war is sort of launched out of. But it's like you're looking around at just this unbelievably beautiful place. And it was like in such contrast to what I believed I was coming here for, or what I was there for, like to fight in a war. And it just like didn't compute. Like this is too beautiful a place to be having a war fought. But I mean, very quickly after sort of seeing this environment and being like, oh my gosh, we were quickly ushered over to this like holding area, and we had to grab our stuff. And then before long, we had jumped into these very up-armored military vehicles called RGs, which are like 50,000 ton anti-IED vehicles. Basically, if it detonates underneath you, in theory, you'll survive. And out we go, from the base we were on out to this like very forward operating base that was sort of out in the sticks. And it was like sort of a vulnerable spot. And it was where we were going to be operating from for the next 6 months. Our mission was pretty vulnerable. We were out sort of actually actively fighting the war. But that first night we get to our actual base, this very stripped down, like very vulnerable spot out in the middle of nowhere. And when we got there, there were, the previous team was still there. They were wrapping up their deployment. And there were interpreters who are a central part of the warfighting effort, from our side. And a lot of these interpreters who are pretty young, like in their 20s, like they've been out there working with various units that have come through those bases for years. And because they're working with NATO, they don't have a place outside of the base. Like, they're targeted by the Taliban and other sort of militant groups because, they're working for NATO. They're traitors, And so the great promise for these interpreters is that by working with NATO, eventually they'll be given the opportunity to leave Afghanistan and come to the United States. And for some people that's true, not true for everybody. But these interpreters are like hard as nails. They've been in so many gunfights. Like, these people have seen some crazy stuff. And my role was to work with these interpreters. I was going to be someone that worked with our partner force. And so I get to this little outstation. It's late at night and it's sort of overwhelming, this whole thing. The team that was already there, SEAL Team 8, they were so cowboy by this point. They'd been in combat now for the last 6 months. They're all just jacked and huge beards. They could care less about anything. And I'm super green. And I went and I met with one of our interpreters to sort of give me a lay of the land of what to expect over the next couple of days. And so we talked about some operations we'd likely do and sort of, got to know each other a little bit. But at some point, one of these interpreters, the guy I was talking to, who maybe was 25, 26, and I was in my 20s too, he said to me, he goes, bro, and they all talk in Western slang. Their English is rugged, American military slang because they're around 18-year-old Marines 24/7. He's like, bro, have you heard the story of what was in the cave in Kandahar? Now, we were in a different part of Afghanistan, but he was referencing Kandahar, Afghanistan. And what I would come to find out is there was this story about a giant, a creature, some huge creature that lived in a cave out in the mountains of Kandahar. And Afghanistan, again, is this huge, just mountains everywhere. And there are all these cave systems up in these mountains, some of which are untouched by humanity. And this terp was like, bro, I'm telling you, it's real. There was a giant up in the caves in Kandahar. Have you heard about this? I want to know more. The interpreter did. And so, we didn't really talk much more than that, but it was planted in my mind that there was this real belief by this interpreter that there was some truth to this, what sounded like sort of a folklore, this crazy story about a giant in a cave. And so it stuck with me. It stuck with me that I'd heard that story. Fast forward, years later, I'm out of the military. And I've become MrBallen, I've begun telling strange, dark, and mysterious stories on the internet. And I was thinking about what stories I wanted to tell. This was in the very early days of having the channel. And I suddenly remembered the Kandahar Giant. And I was like, man, I want to look into that and see if there's any truth to what my interpreter was getting at. And sure enough, I found this treasure trove of testimony from this special operations group, the Green Berets, that apparently did. This one particular group of Green Berets that apparently came in touch with something otherworldly up in the caves of Kandahar. And in particular, there was one soldier who just went by Mr. K because he was worried about his name getting out there, who gave just shocking testimony about what they saw. And so I felt like I needed to do this story justice. I wanted to sort of compile the notes and put together a story that, sort of picked up where my interpreter had began. And I told the story years and years ago. And tonight, I'm going to tell you that story again. So in 2002, there was this Army infantry unit that was out doing a patrol in the Kandahar mountain range. And again, you got to picture just massive snow-covered mountains. I mean, this is a huge area. And, a lot of times in 2002, these patrols, you'd be sort of looking potentially for cave systems where Taliban fighters would be camping out, or, sometimes there'd be fighters that were down in the valleys below. But these patrols were fairly routine for NATO in 2002. And so this unit, they're out on patrol, and generally the way it works, really independent of what branch of the military you're in the US military, when you're out on patrol, you basically update some level of higher command as you're doing the operation. And also, by the way, virtually no operations, no matter how routine or mundane, no operations aren't planned out. Everything is planned. What time you get there, how long you're going to be there, what you're trying to do, when you're going to leave, what platform you're going to use to leave. Everything is really coordinated. And so this unit, they went out, for the umpteenth time to do this patrol. And at some point in the middle of this patrol, the higher command lost contact with them. And the reason this immediately stood out as problematic is, it wasn't totally unusual for a group to lose comms. I mean, you're trying to communicate across huge mountain ranges, using, these radios that are really a lot of times not that great. And so losing comms is not that unusual. But generally speaking, like a lot of times if you lose comms, you get it back pretty quickly. And so there had been a pretty long period of time where no one could get in touch with this unit. And then on top of that, as higher command was beginning to figure out like what we should do here, should we send out a quick reaction force to go find them? Should we send, air assets overhead to go try to look for them that way? As they're thinking about that, somebody realized that not only had they suddenly gone silent, this huge infantry unit, but also they had not called in a TIC before they went silent. So a TIC, or Troops in Contact, is the acronym for basically being in a gunfight. And the reason this is important is, when you're in a combat zone, your higher command doesn't automatically know if you're getting shot at or if you're in an active gunfight. You need to call it in. And the reason you call it in is because you may need huge help. You might want air assets to come in and save the day. You might need a medevac. You might need reinforcements. And so basically the instant you start getting shot at, commanders on the ground, or whoever's on the ground, could be someone super junior, they'll call into higher command and say, troops in contact, tick, 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 tick. And the reason they do that is basically to have help on standby. Now they're like, okay, we know something's going down, we're ready to support. And in fact, what we saw when we were in Afghanistan is, if anything, we were like too quick to call in a tick, because it's sort of like a cheat code, right? Like, oh, I think I heard gunfire way over there, call in a tick. And then immediately you got like warthogs overhead and crazy assets everywhere, like you're totally protected. Well, we sort of took advantage of it. And a lot of people did. Like, it's rare for the reverse to happen. Like, people are not conservative calling this in. And so for an entire unit to suddenly go like silent, having not called in a tick, it's either a huge like radio problem, but that usually gets resolved relatively quickly, or it's something else, something that is just harder to define because it just doesn't really happen very much. And so after a certain amount of time had passed, when still no one could get in touch with this unit, ultimately the Army decided this was, a big enough deal. There was enough people in that unit that were now unaccounted for, that they decided to send in an elite military unit to try to find them. And so they tapped this Green Beret unit. So the Army's top special forces team, the Green Berets, they grabbed a group of those guys and said, you go out into the mountains of Kandahar to their last known location and figure out what happened to them. And one of the people that was in this detachment of Green Berets was Mr. K, one of the people that gave pretty incredible testimony that I'm about to relay to you right now. So Mr. K and the rest of his small group of Green Berets, they hop on helicopters and they fly out to this section of Kandahar where, this infantry unit was last. And they touch down, and you got to understand that this is like rural as rural can be. There is, no people. Like, there's no cities, no nothing. There's like mud huts periodically, but it's just like mountains. You kind of feel like sometimes when you're in Afghanistan that you're like almost on a different planet. And so they touch down and they look around and they see nobody. Like, there's no locals. There's certainly no, American military or NATO. It's just like a wasteland in all directions. And they know that the area they're searching is pretty sizable and it's very mountainous. So it's going to be like a very rough several days of basically hiking through the mountains trying to find any sign of this unit. And so they touch down, and they all have like extremely heavy packs on. I mean, you got all your ammo, your equipment, like this is a rugged thing they're doing. And they start hiking through the mountains. Based on the brief that unit had given before they stepped out for this mission, they sort of had a rough idea, Mr. K and his unit, of the direction of travel. And so they're sort of following that direction. But as they're hiking through the mountains, I mean, the unit that Mr. K was a part of, they didn't find anybody. And for several days, I mean, they're out there in the mountains just hiking all day. They came into contact a couple of times with the enemy, but there wasn't even any ticks or anything. It was just like at a distance, like, oh, there's some fighters over there. But they're on a mission to find these missing soldiers. So they're not trying to engage with anybody else. Like, they're just hiking and looking for any sign of this unit. But again, for a few days, they couldn't find anything. Finally, though, on the 4th day of this rescue mission, so during the daytime, Mr. K and his team, they're walking along the mountain range, and they decide to take this goat trail that they can see right ahead of them. It sort of goes up and over the top of this mountain. They decide, okay, we're just going to take that goat trail and see what's on the other side. There wasn't any clear agenda for why this goat trail was of interest, but they're like, oh, everywhere else we're walking is just rugged and awful. At least this goat trail, a literal trail made by goats running along this area, is easier to walk on. So let's take that, we'll follow it to the other side, and we'll see what's up there. And also we'll be up higher, and we can maybe get a view down into the valley on the other side, and maybe we'll see something. And so Mr. K and the rest of the Green Berets began making their way up this goat trail, which sort of, meandered its way up and then eventually onto the other side. And as they're walking up, they start to notice these little bits of plastic and metal sort of strewn about on the trail. And at first, as they're walking, they don't actually know what they are. But as they keep moving, they start to realize that these are parts of military equipment. Like, these are parts of radios and other stuff that would definitely belong to, for example, an infantry unit. And so now, like, Mr. K and the others, they got their rifles sort of ready to go. They're walking up more apprehensively because they're thinking, like, this is obviously connected to what we're looking for. Like, who knows what we're going to find once we cross the top of this mountain? Like, are we going to find, like, a bloodbath? Are we going to find the missing unit waiting for us? Like, they don't know. And so they continue walking up this trail, and as they get higher and higher, they find bigger and bigger pieces of military equipment on the ground, like whole military backpacks, like bigger chunks of radios. And then also they began finding bits of uniform, like military uniforms that even in some cases still had like name tags and patches on them. And they were able to see very clearly that those uniforms, at least, definitely belonged to the specific unit they were looking for. So they know, like, they've discovered their first real lead here, and it doesn't look good. And so up the goat trail they go, and they finally get to the very top. And I say this, I'm trying not to be biased, because obviously I was a Navy SEAL, and I think very highly of U.S. Special Operations and their training. But, Green Berets and Navy SEALs, they're very different and definitely do different jobs. But in many ways, they are peers, certainly in terms of like the rigor of training. And one of the things that is just absolutely true, and I've seen it in combat, is that when stuff gets wild, like in a combat scenario, in a dangerous scenario, these Green Berets would have absolutely fallen into their training like flawlessly. This would not have been, no matter how crazy or how insane whatever they saw on the other side of the mountain, whatever it was going to be, they were ready for it. And so they would have been like dialed in, making their way up the mountain, getting ready to handle whatever's up there. And so, Mr. K and his team, they make their way to the very top of this goat trail. And when they crested the top, what they saw was like this plateau. So it wasn't like a peak, it was like this flat section of the mountain. And actually there was another section of the mountain that sort of went up beyond the plateau, and there were these huge like cave entrances that sort of basically fed out. These 3 cave entrances fed out onto this plateau, as if it was like the plateau was the front porch, and the cave entrances are like the doors that lead into this upper section of the mountain. And on this plateau, scattered all over the place, is not just, more pieces of military equipment, but also pretty obviously human bones, or what appeared to be human bones, like scattered about. And there was, no living people up here. The missing unit was definitely not up here. But it looked like if they were up here, something horrible happened to them. And so once they reached the plateau, again, you got a picture like this elite military unit, they would have immediately taken up positions all around this plateau, because they know these cave entrances have to be explored. You have to see who's inside of there. Like, is the missing unit in there? Are the remaining survivors taking shelter in there? Are there combatants in there? And so Mr. K and his unit, they sort of detailed taking up positions, getting ready to engage if they had to. And then once they were in position, Mr. K and the guy he was next to, his shooting buddy, if you will, were tapped to go up to the entrance of one of these caves and just look inside. And so silently they got up and they walked across this plateau while the rest of the team is sort of looking outward and also looking in. So there's 360-degree security. So Mr. K, he walks up along with his shooting buddy, and he said he looked into this entrance, this huge, massive entrance, like could easily just walk into this opening, but it's totally dark inside. And so he goes into the cave, And once he gets in there, like, it's very dark, and he's sort of trying to look inside to see if he can see anything. And it does go back a little ways, but, you know, he barely takes a couple of steps into the cave when he realizes, like, there's like this sheer cliff within the cave. Like, you basically walk in and then it shoots straight down. And, you know, Mr. K, he caught himself and he looked down to see if he could see what was down sort of in this pit within the cave, but it was just too dark. He couldn't see anything. And then, like, as he's standing back up again, getting ready to sort of assess what he should do next, he sees like a flash of movement in the far backside of the cave, basically beyond this crevasse that he can't cross. And so Mr. K instinctively raises his gun like he's ready to engage whatever this is, but before he can, this enormous spear, like a massive javelin, comes soaring out of the cave and impales the shooting buddy. His name was Dan, the other Green Beret that was next to Mr. K, who went up to explore the cave. The spear impales him, sends him flying back, and this is in plain view of all the other Green Berets. They all see this happen, and then, like, in the space of a few seconds, this massive, just enormous human creature, this like 12-foot tall thing, comes bounding out of the cave, clears the crevasse, and charges out onto the plateau. And it sort of looked like a huge person, but again, it's like 12 feet tall. It's got 6 fingers on each hand, 6 toes on each foot. It's wearing various animal skins, got this huge red hair, red beard, and it runs out to, you know, presumably attack the Green Berets. But immediately they just start shooting it, and in like seconds, this massive creature falls to the ground, dead. And so at this point, like, after the creature is down, I mean, nobody knows what to make of this, but again, it's like they fall back into their training. They immediately, once they know the threat is down and there's nobody else coming out of the cave, they run over to Dan to provide, you know, life-saving care. But Dan's dead. I mean, he was killed by this javelin. And so now the team, they poked their head into the cave to make sure there wasn't anybody else, but as far as they knew, there wasn't. And for sure, this giant was dead. And so, like, they hadn't found the missing military unit, but now they have a casualty, and like they have this horrible thing that's happened. And so one of the team leads for this Green Beret team, they end up calling higher command, and they say, hey, you got to come get us. Like, we can't even tell you what just happened, but we have a man down, killed in action, and we have this combatant, this creature, we don't even know what to call it, but you got to get out here, and you got to take this thing too. We don't even know what it is. And so not long after, 2 helos showed up, and one of them was to transport the Green Berets and to transport Dan back to the base. And then the other helo had this huge net that they basically wrapped around this dead, huge giant, and they strapped it up to the underside of the helo, and then they flew off with this giant. And, you know, Mr. K and his unit, they expected to be brought back to base and to basically debrief the mission, which, you know, in layman's terms means you basically talk through what actually happened and you sort of put it down in your after action report, like what happened, you know, what mistakes were made, what did we do, like you basically put it on the record, like what happened. And then you do it typically like right afterwards. Even if you've had like a casualty, you immediately document what's happened. And so they go back to base expecting not only to tell their story about seeing this giant, if you will, but to maybe get some clarification about what the heck just happened. Like, you know, they wanted some more information, but when they got back to base and they did their after action report, which they sort of did on their own, nobody came to talk to them. The unit was sort of pushed off to the side and told to just, you know, write down what you saw and just leave it at that. After they wrote it all down and they included, you know, the truth, everybody on the team saw what they saw. They were told by higher command that they actually could not publish those details in their after action report, and they had to change it. Like, we can't say you fought a giant in a cave. We can't say that. Like, there's no way that's true. You can't say it. And so Mr. K and his team, like, despite knowing it wasn't true, they went and they changed the report. And they just said they came in contact with the enemy, and the enemy, you know, through small arms fire, killed Dan. And then after they submitted this, you know, erroneous report, they were then told to sign all these non-disclosure agreements to basically say they would not talk about what they actually saw in that cave. And after that, I mean, Dan and the rest of his unit, I mean, they were basically told, you can't talk about this. This is too sensitive. And they even went looking for more information about it. And they found that all of the reporting in Afghanistan around that time about that operation had been heavily redacted. I mean, Mr. K never even found out what happened to the missing unit that they had gone out looking for. Like, it was just this big mystery. But fast forward 14 years to 2016, and Mr. K just felt like he didn't want to keep this a secret anymore. And he spoke to some other members of his team that were there, and they too were just like really shaken up by what happened and just felt like it was wrong that nobody knew. And so that's what ultimately prompted Mr. K to go public with his story. And also when he went public, what he also discovered is that other people sort of in the military hierarchy also had some level of exposure to this giant. I mean, what Mr. K would discover is that after the giant had been hoisted in that net by that helo and flown off somewhere, apparently it had been brought to an airfield in Afghanistan, another NATO base, and pilots that were going to be transporting this to another base remember seeing this 12 to 15 foot tall giant looking person with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot in this net. They remember seeing it and actually describing it in their after action report. And they would say they were told not to include those details. And those details were redacted and made top secret. And so basically Mr. K, after coming forward, quickly learned through the grapevine that basically everybody affiliated with the giant was told not to talk about it. And the government basically shut it down, redacted it, and made it top secret. Now, I don't really know what to make of this story. You know, there's a part of me that does want to believe that, the testimony of Mr. K is totally legitimate. But there's also a part of me that knows that, this could all just be made up. But a lot of people claim to have seen this thing. And I remember so distinctly, my own interpreter back in 2013 being so convinced that there was something in the caves in Kandahar and he really wanted to know more about it. It's like, there's some level of truth to this. I mean, I was, in Afghanistan and I was in the mountains of Afghanistan, not Kandahar, I was in Logar. But I mean, we used to walk by and look up and see these cave entrances. And I gotta tell you, it's unsettling. I mean, who knows what's inside of those things? It doesn't seem entirely impossible that a giant could be in there, like this is a landscape that's just, it's different. It's like a different planet out there. But I mean, really what you're left with here is you have an entire infantry unit that's still unaccounted for, at least publicly. And you have an Army Green Beret in Dan who was killed in front of his team and they want answers. And, it's like what you see is the government apparently went to great lengths to cover up what happened, or to at least disguise the truth. Whether or not they're covering something up remains to be seen, but I think there's more to this story that we simply don't know. But I'd love to hear what you think in the comments, so why don't you let me know in the comments and I'll get back to as many people as I can. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio, Jordan Stidham, and Cole Lacasio. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you want to hear more like it, go ahead and check out our YouTube channel, just called MrBallen, where we have hundreds more stories, a lot like this one, but most of them are not available on this podcast. They are only available on that YouTube channel, which again is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's story is about a 3-year period in France where people were going missing at an alarming rate and nobody knew why. But eventually it was discovered why. And let me tell you, it is absolute nightmare fuel. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do. and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to walk the Follow Button's dog, but then just immediately go sell their dog in the parking lot of a big box store. Okay, let's get into today's story. Early on the morning of January 12th, 1765, a 12-year-old boy named Jacques Portufis sat up suddenly in his bed, breathing hard. The room was pitch black that he was in, but he could feel he was sweating and his heart was racing, and he tried to shake his head to kind of wipe the nightmare he had just had from his mind, but he just couldn't do it. All he could think about was how in this nightmare, something had been chasing him, and he had been running for his life, and he was trying to get away, but whatever this thing was, this horrible beast that was following him, it just kept getting closer and closer and closer until it finally got him, and that's what woke him up. Jacques reached up and touched his face, and he realized he was crying, and he quickly wiped the tears away because he didn't want any of his brothers or sisters to see that he was crying. Jacques was the oldest of 8 kids in his family, and all of them slept in the same small room on straw-filled mattresses inside of their family's little cottage in the southern French province of GWaudan. And so, Jacques, he's looking around the bedroom to make sure none of his siblings had woken up and seen him in this state, and he was relieved to see that they were all still fast asleep. Everybody made fun of Jacques for being a scaredy cat, for being a coward. And to Jacques, this really hurt his feelings because on some level, he knew it was kind of true. In fact, just a couple of months earlier, he had lost in a physical fight with a much younger boy, and afterwards, Jacques had cried. And the whole town had seen this happen, and so afterward, all the kids began calling Jacques the wet chicken, and even Jacques' brothers and sisters began joining in and calling him the wet chicken and really making him feel totally ashamed. And it wasn't like the adults in this village were stepping up and protecting Jacques, because to them, Jacques was kind of like a liability. In this part of France, the winters were brutal. People died all the time in this village from the weather. And then the summers brought all these outbreaks of disease, which wiped out even more people in this village. And so by and large, where Jacques lived, it was kind of like the survival of the fittest. And many kids didn't live that long unless they were really hardy and tough, like their parents who had managed to survive for that long. But Jacques was just not like that. He was very gentle and peaceful, yet somehow he had survived. And Jacques really was not trying to become this kind of macho guy. Instead, he really wanted to be a priest, like his uncle. But his uncle lived far away, and so it was tough to see his uncle all that often, to learn about, how to become a priest. But anytime Jacques did get a chance to actually see his uncle, he would have a chance to read all these books and study alongside his uncle. And so for a little while, it was like Jacques was transported away from the hardships of his village to the life that in many ways he wished he had. A quiet, peaceful, very studious life. But deep down, Jacques felt like there was no chance he would ever actually escape this little village where he effectively was an outcast. Even though the sun had not risen yet, Jacques just sat on his bed and couldn't fall asleep again after waking up from this nightmare. And so just sitting there in the dark and the quiet, Jacques began to think about what he had to do later that day when the sun did come up. And like usual, Jacques started to feel afraid. And so Jacques eventually just laid down with his eyes open, and he laid there until dawn when one of his younger brothers named Jean, who was 8 years old, rolled over and pushed him and said, "Hey, wet chicken, it's time to get up. It's our day with the sheep. Let's go." Jacques scowled at his younger brother and shoved him back, but not that hard, because Jacques never really shoved anybody that hard, no matter what they did to him. And then both boys hopped out of their bed, they wolfed down some bread and cheese, and then headed out the door. As soon as they were outside, Jacques noticed that the village was much quieter than it normally was. But then again, these days, villagers did not leave their homes unless they absolutely had to. And so Jacques and Jean made their way away from their cottage down the dirt road to the pen where their family kept all of their sheep. And the boys opened up the gate and then used their staffs to kind of corral the sheep out of the gate back onto the road. And as the sheep kind of bleated and baaed and bumped into each other, the boys worked hard to kind of organize them on the road. And then once the sheep understood which direction they were going, towards the forest, a very familiar walk for the sheep, they kind of fell into line and just began walking very casually, like they knew exactly where to go. And once the sheep had fallen into this kind of routine rhythm, Jacques and Jean fell in behind them and just walked quietly after them. And as the boys walked, they both constantly kept looking left and right and ahead of the sheep and behind them, constantly scanning for danger, because they knew something was out here. For months now, children all across this province in France, GWaudan, had been going missing. They'd go off into fields or pastures, like when they're moving their family's livestock around, and the kids would just vanish. And then sometimes, if they were found again, they'd be found totally mutilated far from where they should have been. The attacks on these kids across GWaudan had begun a year earlier on June 30th, 1764. On that day, a 14-year-old girl, who actually was the older sister of one of Jacques' friends, had disappeared and then been found again later that day, partially eaten in a field near her home after she had not come home with the family's cattle. Now, of course, this was very tragic, but to this point, there had not been any other attacks, so there was no pattern here, and so the assumption was she must have been attacked by a wolf, which did happen, and often 2 children, because kids at this time in France were often in charge of tending to their family's grazing animals, the way Jacques and Jean were going out with their sheep. These kids were small, they couldn't really defend themselves, and if a wolf set onto them, there was very little they could do. But 5 weeks after this 14-year-old girl was found dead and mutilated in the field, 2 more teenagers were also found mutilated and dead in a field. And really, this was only the beginning. As summer turned to fall that year, more and more kids went missing and then turned up dead in fields, partially mutilated. And the more these attacks happened across southern France, the more people thought to themselves, this can't be a wolf. Number one, wolves don't go on extended human killing sprees. That's just not a thing. And number two, if it was a wolf, they would be eating more of their victims. They wouldn't just rip their body to shreds and then leave them. They would eat the meat. And so, by this early January day in 1765, as Jacques and Jean were setting out for the day with their family's sheep, the death toll from whatever was killing these kids was now well into the dozens. People in France had begun calling whatever was killing these children the Beast of GWaudan, and stories about this creature began popping up in newspapers all over France. People all across southern France began forming these huge hunting parties to go out into the forests and the wilds of GWaudan to find this creature and kill it, but they would always come back empty-handed. And then every now and again, a hunter would be out and they would see a huge wolf and they would kill it and they would declare that they had found and killed the Beast of GWaudan. But the attacks on these kids all across this province just continued. So obviously that wolf was not it. And so as these attacks continued, all the fairs and festivals that normally would pop up all year long, all across southern France, those all stopped because people were afraid to go out in fear of this creature. And then, of course, in villages like Jacques' village, people really just stopped going out unless they had to, again, because of the Beast of GWaudan. But Jacques and Jean's family relied on their livestock, and they needed their sheep to go out and graze. And so, on this day in January, Jacques and Jean had to go out because their sheep had to graze. Their family relied on the sheep, livestock was their livelihood, and so this was a mandatory thing. And so, as Jacques and Jean continued walking behind their herd of sheep down this dirt road towards the forest, the 2 boys eventually came to a stop and just turned around and looked back at their village, and they saw walking on the road towards them were 5 more kids, along with 2 additional herds of sheep that these 5 kids were in charge of. Ever since the Beast of GWaudan had become a thing, Jacques and Jean had begun tending their sheep along with these 5 kids and their sheep. They figured the bigger their group was, the safer they were from this creature. As the 5 kids got closer to Jacques and Jean, Jacques realized that one of the kids that was with them this day was a tall, thin redhead. it was the same younger boy who had recently beaten Jacques up in front of the village, and he had cried and everyone had made fun of him. And so Jacques sees this kid coming, and immediately he can feel his face burning with embarrassment. And then the boy, he sees Jacques, and he immediately smirks and begins flapping his arms like chicken wings. But once these 5 kids and their sheep joined Jacques and Jean and their sheep, they all kind of just went quiet, because none of them wanted to be out there. They were all scared of the Beast of GWaudan, and the only reason they were together was, again, to be safe from this creature that was killing kids left and right. And so, in relative silence, all of the kids and their sheep just slowly walked together down this dirt path, and eventually they made it into the big forest, where just beyond the forest was the pasture where these sheep would graze. And as the group actually entered into the trees and it became dark and more quiet and kind of eerie, Jean actually tugged on Jacques' shoulder and said, "Will you please tell a story?" Because Jean was scared too. The kids were all scared, and they figured, if Jacques just told a story, it would take their mind off of how tense this moment was. And when Jacques heard this request, he actually smiled, because this was something he loved to do. He was a great storyteller. It was like his one strength. When Jean had asked for the story, the kids and the sheep had actually made it to really the end of the forest path. And so by the time Jacques was about to start his story, all the sheep had made their way out of the forest onto this big open pasture right in the middle of the forest. And so as the sheep just kind of filtered out into this open area, Jacques stopped, and all the kids kind of came up right behind him, and Jacques started his story by pointing across the pasture to this bog that was right at the base of this big hill, and he said, "Do you see those big rocks in that bog over there? Well, you see the biggest rock? Well, that's not really a rock. It's actually a doorway, and if you move the rock underneath it, there's a portal to another world." And so as Jacques began telling this very creative story about this kingdom that existed underneath the bog, he sat down against a rock, kind of facing out towards the sheep, and all the other kids kind of filed in around him, taking seats, with Jean, his brother, sitting right behind him to his right. And Jacques, he was just really into the story to the point where he kind of forgot about what was happening with the sheep, and he wasn't scanning around for danger, and neither were any of the kids, including the redhead who had beaten Jacques up. He wanted to act like he wasn't into his story, but in reality, he totally was, and he was just as interested in what was going on with the magical kingdom below this rock. And finally, when Jacques got to the end of his story, where this evil giant that had been tormenting the kingdom under the bog had been tricked by an orphan to try to go through this magical portal into their world, and the giant had gotten stuck in the doorway because he was so big, and he never tormented the kingdom again, and they lived happily ever after. When Jacques got to that point in the story and all the kids are totally locked in and not paying attention to anything else, 2 things happened in rapid succession. The first was, even though Jacques is telling the story and focusing on that, in the back of his mind, he registers hearing the sound of twigs breaking somewhere right behind him, almost like the sound of someone or something moving along the forest floor. And the second thing that happened was the red-headed kid who had beaten up Jacques, without saying a word, just stood up and began sprinting towards the pasture. And for a moment, Jacques thought this kid, who was kind of like a bully, was doing this on purpose to be rude to Jacques, to kind of run away at the climax of the story like he didn't care about it. But then Jacques realized that he smelled something terrible behind him. But when Jacques turned around to see what was making this smell, he saw that his brother, Jean, who had been sitting right behind him to his right, was now gone, and where he had been sitting was just his staff laying on the ground. And for a second, Jacques just couldn't process what his eyes were seeing. He didn't understand how his brother could have gotten away from him without him noticing. But before Jacques could do anything, all the kids around him that were still there began screaming and pointing up towards this hill that was right behind them. And so Jacques turned around, and to his horror, he saw there was this huge 12-foot-tall creature that was covered in fur. It looked like an oversized wolf, but it was standing on 2 legs, and its bones seemed like they were too big for its own skin, and it made it seem very angular and jagged. And as it kind of loped grotesquely up the hillside, Jacques realized it was carrying in its front arm Jean, who was screaming and kicking but could not get away from this creature. Jacques understood that this was the Beast of GWaudan, and it was going to go kill his brother. And immediately, Jacques is thinking, "You gotta run away, get to safety, get out of here." And all the kids around him, that's what they did. They took off running towards the pasture. They didn't care about Jean. They only cared about themselves. And so Jacques, he knows he needs to get away, save himself, but his legs just will not move. He is rooted to the spot because something inside of him told him he has to save his brother. It doesn't matter if everyone thinks he's a coward. That's his brother. He needs to do something. And so Jacques, he turns to the kids who are running away from him and he screams at them to stop, come back. And the kids were so surprised to hear this strong, authoritative voice coming out of the wet chicken that they did stop and turned around to see what he wanted. And he said, get over here, I have a plan. And so the kids, with the exception of the redhead who had run off by himself, they came back to Jacques, and Jacques began telling them his plan to save Jean. And the kids, again, were so taken with how Jacques was really owning this moment and being a leader that they all said, okay, let's do this. And so after this very quick planning meeting, all the kids turned and began running up the hillside towards the Beast of GWaudan with Jacques in the front with his staff out. And the kids gained on the beast really quickly, and the creature clearly noticed and kept turning around and kept looking at these kids getting closer and closer, but the beast did not seem interested in any of them. It just wanted Jean. And in fact, it moved Jean from its arm up into its mouth, and then the creature began kind of using the trees to pull itself faster and faster away from the kids. But Jacques, he just kept going faster and faster and pushing himself to get closer and closer. And as he did, it motivated the other kids to follow along and push it and gain on this creature. And finally, they got close enough to this beast that Jacques yelled out to the kids, now! And they all fanned out around it and began smashing this beast with their staffs they used to shepherd their livestock. Now, none of their blows to this creature were doing any real damage, and the creature did not really seem fazed that the kids were now attacking it, but they were kind of able, with their strikes to this creature, to direct it and get it to kind of turn in the direction that Jacques had told them to make the creature go. And so the kids continued to beat and poke and corral this creature, and every time they'd hit it, the beast would kind of flail out with one of its arms, but it never really did anything because, again, it's really focused, obviously, on taking Jean. But eventually, Jacques' plan worked. He had corralled the creature to the top of the hillside, right over where that bog was, where those rocks in the middle were part of the story that Jacques had told about how there was this portal to another world. And once this creature was positioned where Jacques wanted it, he again yelled to the kids to do the next phase of their plan. And all the kids kind of fanned out to the top of the hill, and with their staffs, they beat and poked this creature down the hill into the bog. And as they did this, Jacques kept looking to see if Jean was alive, because earlier he had been screaming and kicking, but now there was blood all over his brother, and he was limp in the creature's mouth, and he wasn't making any sound. But Jacques didn't care. He wanted to get his brother back, dead or alive. And so finally, Jacques stepped forward from the group, and he wound up and he smashed the beast as hard as he could, hard enough that the beast actually kind of stumbled forward into the actual marshy bog. And what Jacques knew about this bog and why he had come up with that particular story about there being a gateway to another world is weeks earlier, he had actually accidentally stepped into this bog and saw it was really deep. And he had been lucky enough that he had grabbed a rock and kind of pulled himself out, because if he hadn't, the bog kind of functioned like quicksand. You could get stuck in the bog and never get out again. And this is what happened to the Beast of GWaudan. It went feet first into the one spot of the bog that Jacques had had all the kids corral it to, that was the deepest and most dangerous part. And as soon as the beast stepped into it, it sunk down to its waist. And immediately the beast reached out with its huge muscular arms and tried to pull itself out of the bog, but it couldn't. It was stuck. And so in its panic, it let go of Jean from its mouth, and it actually turned around, and it looked at Jacques and the other kids. And when it did, Jacques almost lost his nerve, because when he saw this thing face to face up close, he saw this was not a wolf's face. This was almost like a human face. Its eyes were making distinct eye contact with Jacques, and it was furious. It was like the beast understood that Jacques had just trapped it. He had tricked the beast into walking into this bog, and it wanted to kill Jacques. And for a moment, Jacques was totally entranced by this creature's eyes. It just struck him that this looks human. It looks intelligent. What is this thing? And while Jacques was kind of in this daze, The creature reached forward and slashed his stomach wide open, and Jacques fell backwards on the ground, but luckily he was far enough away from the beast that he couldn't be pulled back in. And in this kind of frantic moment, one of the other kids saw an opportunity and ran forward, grabbed Jean, who was laying on the surface of the bog, and he pulled him away from the beast. And the beast whipped around. He tried to grab Jean, but he couldn't. And so all of a sudden, all these kids were safely away from the Beast of GWaudan, who was totally trapped. And so at this point, the other kids who were not hurt, they scooped up Jacques and they scooped up Jean, and they began running away from the bog across the pasture back towards the village, leaving the beast where it was. And as they ran, they heard it bellowing out and roaring and trying to pull itself out, but it still just remained in the bog. And finally, as they got back to that dirt path that led back to the village, they saw there was a group of armed villagers running towards them, because it would turn out the redhead who had ran off, he had told the village, and they were coming out to help the kids. And so as the armed villagers met with the kids, they told them where the beast was, stuck in that bog, and the villagers took off to go kill the beast. And then the kids, along with Jacques and Jean, they went into the village. They were put into a home and put on beds, by which point the village doctor had come over and began treating both of them. Jean was alive, but just barely. He had lost a lot of blood, and the beast had grabbed onto his scalp and really crushed his skull, but he would ultimately survive. As for Jacques, it was a very painful wound that he had sustained on his stomach, but none of his internal organs had been damaged, and so he would also survive as well. As for the armed villagers, even though they very quickly got out to that bog where the beast was, when they got there, the beast was gone. And the Beast of GWaudan would continue to kill people for another 2 years, until June 19th, 1767, when a hunter happened to encounter it in the middle of a forest, and he shot and killed it. And by that point, over 100 people had been murdered by this creature. The hunter would drag the carcass of the beast back into his village, and a doctor would perform an autopsy, but the doctor was unable to identify what kind of animal it was. It did kind of look like a wolf, a really huge wolf, but its body was just so misshapen and its bones were too big, and it clearly walked on 2 legs, not on all 4s, and so there was never any definitive information about what this even was and how this even happened. But when they opened up its stomach, they did find human body parts. Jacques was one of the only people to have ever survived an encounter with the Beast of GWaudan, and so he was celebrated all across France. And he quickly went from being the wet chicken to the little hero, and his story would reach as far away as Boston, Massachusetts. And in fact, Jacques' story was so well publicized that it eventually reached King Louis XV, and he was so moved by it that he invited Jacques to come meet him, and after meeting Jacques, he loved him and offered to pay for his entire education. And so Jacques would get to finally leave this little village where he never quite fit in, and he would move to northern France and enroll in a prestigious school there, and he would spend his days reading and writing just like he had always hoped for. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, the MrBallen podcast, as well as MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, Late Nights with Nexpo, and A Twist of History. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Tonight, I'm going to share one of the most credible alien abduction stories ever. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right campfire, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time you go camping with the follow button, wait until they're about to go to sleep, and then just go ahead and pour a ton of itching powder into their only sleeping bag. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into tonight's story. Around 3:30 p.m. on October 25th, 1974, a 41-year-old man named Carl Higdon drove his work truck along a paved road in the Medicine Bow National Forest, which is this huge nature preserve in southern Wyoming. Carl had taken off early from his job on an oil rig to go elk hunting in this preserve, and now he was heading towards this very specific area in the national forest called McMarty Canyon that he had heard was really good for elk hunting. As Carl drove, he found himself looking around at the evergreen trees and the snow-capped mountains in the distance, and he just felt this total sense of calm come over him. He was a very rugged outdoorsman, and there was really nothing he loved more than spending time out in nature all alone. And so for a little while, he was just enjoying himself, driving along, until eventually the paved road he was on gave way to this long, rocky trail. And Carl, he didn't want to damage the truck he was driving, since it actually belonged to the company he worked for. So he wound up pulling over and getting out, and then he just grabbed all his stuff and continued walking on the trail by foot. The hike along this trail was not only, pretty rocky and rough, but it was also predominantly uphill. And so it didn't take long before Carl was having trouble breathing. And not just because it was physically taxing, but also because when he was younger, he had tuberculosis, which had left his lungs really riddled with scar tissue that did make it harder to breathe, especially when he was exerting himself. But, Carl continued on, and every few minutes he would just stop and bend over and catch his breath. But after about 30 minutes or so, he had hiked to the point where the trees had begun to thin out, and then he found himself standing inside what looked like a big bowl in the earth. So this was McMarty Canyon, where he was, intending to go for this elk hunt. And, the reason it sort of felt like a bowl is because it was mostly just flat with some shrubs and grass, a few trees, and these tall hills out on the sides, sort of giving this impression of a bowl. And so Carl, he sort of just stopped and took stock of the area. And wouldn't you know it, when he looked straight across the canyon, the bowl, he saw a group of just 5 elk grazing in the distance. Like, this was unbelievably lucky. Here they are, right away. And so Carl slowly began walking towards them, doing his best not to make any noise. And then when he was within shooting distance, he just stopped, raised his rifle, and he looked through his sights to aim at the first elk he saw, and then he pulled the trigger. But for some reason, when he pulled the trigger, the gun didn't go off. It didn't fire, or at least it didn't appear to. And certainly there wasn't any kickback. It just was like nothing happened. But then he saw something that just didn't make any logical sense. And at the same time he's experiencing this just insane phenomenon, he felt this massive wave of vertigo, and then he just sort of felt himself falling, and then he blacked out. The next thing Carl knew, he felt himself being shaken back and forth, and he sort of slowly began to blink his eyes, feeling very confused and disoriented. His head was pounding, it was clearly dark outside, and then he realized, sort of with horror, that somehow he was back inside of his work truck. But the surroundings outside of the truck definitely looked different, like the truck was parked in a different spot than where he'd left it. He suddenly felt himself getting shaken again, and then he heard someone say his name. And he looked up, and in the darkness, he saw there were 2 men that he didn't recognize who were clearly shaking him, trying to get his attention. And they tried to ask him, what was going on? But Carl's mouth sort of felt numb, And when he tried to speak, it's like the words came out garbled and nonsensical. And so at some point, these two men sort of gave up trying to talk to Carl, and they just lifted him up, pulled him out of the truck, and they carried him over to their vehicle. And, Carl heard them say something about a hospital, and then before long, their car was driving off, and then Carl blacked out again. About 30 minutes later, around midnight on October 26th, so this is 8 hours after Carl first blacked out, his wife Marjorie rushed into a hospital room at the Carbon County Memorial Hospital in Rawlins, Wyoming. And inside, she saw Carl lying on the bed, hooked up to an IV, and there were a bunch of monitors with a nurse standing beside him. And she saw, her husband's eyes were open, but clearly unfocused. And then as Marjorie is just standing there, taking in the initial shock of what she's seeing, the nurse actually pointed at her, at Marjorie, and then asked Carl if he knew who she, his wife, who she was. But Carl, he turned and he looked at Marjorie, but he just kind of stared blankly and then shook his head and said no. So earlier that evening, Marjorie had been at home waiting for Carl to come back from his hunting trip. But when he hadn't shown up on time, she ultimately had called the sheriff's department and asked them to go to McMarty Canyon just to check on him. And so 2 deputies had gone out there and they found him, and he was unconscious in his truck. So those 2 deputies were the ones who obviously shook him awake and took him to the hospital. But interestingly, beyond the fact that the deputies had no idea what happened to him, they reported that his truck had been parked 3 miles away from the main road in this muddy bog. And strangely, there were no tire tracks leading to it. It was almost like it was just dropped in the bog with, Carl inside of it. But, despite this weirdness, the deputies, and Marjorie for that matter, were not concerned about, the weirdness around the truck. They were worried about Carl, who's just laying here unconscious. And so they had rushed him to the hospital, and Marjorie had driven there as fast as she could. A doctor had already explained to Marjorie that her husband was, clearly very disoriented and seemed to be suffering from a case of amnesia. He couldn't even remember his own name, let alone, what had happened to him while he was out in that canyon before the deputies showed up and found him passed out in his truck. Doctors had given Carl x-rays and brain scans and run all kinds of tests on him, but not only did they not find any evidence of some sort of head injury, that likely would have caused his amnesia, but they actually didn't find anything wrong with him at all. He seemed perfectly fine beyond him just showing up basically unconscious and disoriented. And so realistically, the staff told Marjorie that because they couldn't really find anything wrong with him, they didn't really know how to treat him. And so for now, Carl was just being kept in the hospital under constant observation. And so Marjorie just took a seat on the couch next to her husband's bed, sort of not even sure what to think of this whole situation. And she was about to ask the nurse a couple of questions, but then suddenly Carl sort of tensed up and began frantically looking around the room, like he really had something in mind that he was looking for. And then he began saying, where are my pills? Marjorie had no idea what pills her husband was talking about, and it was clear the nurse also didn't know what he was talking about. And so Marjorie, she reached out and just tried to grab her husband's hand to try to calm him down. But the moment she did that, Carl sort of stopped what he was doing and he yanked his hand away and stared at her like she was a total stranger. 2 days later, Carl still could not remember what had happened to him when he had gone hunting. But he had recovered some basic memories, like his own name and also who his wife was. And so between that and the fact that realistically Carl did not have any signs of any physical injury, the hospital discharged him and just sent him home with Marjorie and basically told her that he was probably fine and that he probably just needed to be in a familiar place to sort of recover all of his memories and get back to normal. However, when the couple got back home, it very quickly became clear to Marjorie that Carl was not okay and he was not getting better. For the most part, Carl was just unusually quiet at home, like uncharacteristically quiet. And then when he would speak, it often was in that frantic sort of nonsensical way that he had spoken in the hospital when he was, looking for his pills. And in fact, when he was home, he did continue to suddenly start looking for his pills. And then also he began telling Marjorie that, somebody had stolen his elk. Marjorie would try to ask him, what do you mean? What do you mean your pills? What do you mean somebody took your elk? What are you talking about?
But Carl didn't even seem to know. Like, he would have moments of recognizing that it's so crazy what he's saying, but he just didn't have the memories to be filled in. It was like Carl was just as confused by his own vague memories as his wife was. However, a few days after they got home from the hospital, Carl suddenly told his wife that he'd actually remembered something really specific about what had happened when he was hunting. Like, a new memory had popped up in his mind. He told her that when he was in McMarty Canyon and he saw those elk and he raised his rifle and he pulled the trigger, he said there was no sound, there was no kickback, it was like nothing had happened. But then he said something happened that, like, truly just didn't make logical sense. He said he realized the gun had fired, but it was like the world had slowed down and he could actually literally see the bullet leaving the rifle, but like in slow motion. Like, this bullet is trickling out of the gun and slowly making its way, across the canyon, and he's just staring at this bullet. And then the bullet seemed to strike like an invisible wall of sorts. At which point the bullet actually stopped and almost like flipped inside out and sort of flattened and then fell to the ground. And then also, as the flattened inside out bullet fell to the ground, Carl said he too fell to the ground and he blacked out. Now, when Marjorie heard this, her first thought was like, this is nonsense. This is not real. This is something maybe Carl's mind has created to fill in the gaps of his memory, because it's got to be really frustrating for him that he's got all these like fragments that he can't put together. And so maybe this is just his mind filling in the gaps with this really specific and weird imagery. But not long after hearing this story, Marjorie was doing the laundry and she was finally washing the clothes her husband had on when this whole thing happened out in the canyon. And when she reached into the pockets of his jacket to make sure they were empty before, washing the jacket, she felt something metallic. And she pulled out this round, like, flat disc, this metal disc. And at first she just had no idea what it was. But then she thought about what her husband had said about the bullet from his rifle, flipping inside out and flattening and falling to the ground. She couldn't help but feel like this metallic disc that she's holding in her hand that was in her husband's jacket looks an awful lot like a bullet that has been flipped inside out and flattened. Like, she couldn't believe it. Not long after this discovery of the alleged bullet, Marjorie sat next to her husband on a couch inside of an office at the University of Wisconsin. They were both sitting across from a psychology professor named Dr. Leo Sprinkle. Now, Marjorie knew this meeting was sort of a long shot, but she was hopeful that, maybe they would learn something valuable. So by this point, Carl had not recovered any other memories from his hunting trip. But after, recovering the supposed flattened bullet in her husband's jacket, Marjorie became convinced that something truly strange had happened to her husband. I mean, she obviously knew something happened out in the canyon, but now it just seemed like I don't even have any theories for what could have happened, but something really weird must have happened. And so she and Carl were both very determined to try to figure out what happened. And so that's how they ended up in Dr. Sprinkle's office. Dr. Sprinkle was not your average psychologist. He was a really big believer in hypnosis. He practiced hypnosis. And specifically, he believed that hypnosis could potentially allow people to access repressed memories, which is exactly what Marjorie and Dr. Sprinkle, and Carl for that matter, believed was going on with Carl, that he had experienced something that was being repressed. But it was in there, you just need to find a way to access it. So, that day in the professor's office, Marjorie stayed very quiet and just observed, while Dr. Sprinkle told Carl to close his eyes, to relax his head down towards his chest, and just focus on his breathing, in and out, in and out. And after several minutes of this, Dr. Sprinkle told Carl to slowly lift his head back up. And Carl did, but when he looked up, his eyes were actually still closed. And at this point, Dr. Sprinkle asked Carl to tell him what happened on October 25th when he went elk hunting in McMarty Canyon. And Carl, with his eyes still shut, began to speak really fluently. And he began telling just the most insane story Marjorie, or Dr. Sprinkle for that matter, had ever heard. Carl said, again, under hypnosis here, that after he had watched that bullet leave his rifle in slow motion and hit this invisible wall and flip inside out and fall to the ground, he said that he too had fallen basically at the same speed as this bullet onto the ground, and basically he passed out. But he only blacked out for like a second. And when he opened his eyes, he said he was still lying on the grass in the middle of this canyon. Except now, standing over him was this tall, dark figure that was wearing almost like a very tight-fitting bodysuit, almost like what a scuba diver would wear. And Carl said this figure was vaguely, human-shaped, but it had very yellowish skin and very small eyes and no ears and no lips. And there were two antennas sticking out of, its forehead. And one of its arms extended into this flat stump, but the other arm seemed to have almost like a prosthetic attachment at the end of it that almost looked like a power drill. And then, in perfect English, this figure sort of looked down at Carl and just said, "How are you?" And Carl said he was so stunned by this thing speaking to him in perfect English that Carl just sort of blurted out, "Oh, pretty good, pretty good." And the figure seemed satisfied with this answer, and it went on to quickly explain that its name was Ozo-1, and it came from a planet 163,000 light years away from Earth. And it said it had no intention of hurting Carl. In fact, it said it wanted to help Carl. Then, with the hand that sort of resembled a power drill, it reached into what looked like a pocket on its bodysuit, and it pulled out this small packet containing 4 pills. And it told Carl that these pills would heal him. And then this thing offered Carl one of these pills. And Carl, for reasons he couldn't explain, just immediately took the pill and swallowed it. And then after that, Carl said that Ozo-1 asked him if he wanted to go for a ride. And Carl just said, sure. So Ozo-1 helped Carl off the ground. And then as soon as Carl was standing back up again, he saw there was this cube-shaped vehicle not far away. And a split second later, Carl said he was somehow inside of this vehicle, along with Ozo-1 and also 2 other vaguely humanoid figures and the 5 elk that he'd been out here hunting. They were behind this clear wall like a containment pen within the vehicle. And Carl was seated in a chair, as was Ozo-1 and the 2 other humanoids. They were all just sort of sitting there. Then Carl said he felt this powerful force push against his body, like the vehicle was moving so fast that it basically pushed him back into his seat. But less than a minute later, the vehicle just stopped, and Ozo-1 said, "We're home." At this point, Carl was just suddenly standing outside of the vehicle. And he said it felt very cold and the sky was jet black. And then around Carl, the landscape was very different from planet Earth. It was very rocky and desolate without any trees or grass or really any organic looking life anywhere. And then in front of Carl, he said he saw this massive metallic looking tower that sort of reminded him of the Seattle Space Needle. And there was this light on the top of it that was actually so bright that Carl said when he looked at it, it sort of hurt his eyes. And so Ozo-1 led Carl, the 2 other humanoid figures, and the elk to a door on the outside of this tower. And once they were standing outside of it, Carl said the door slid open, but instead of it sort of leading into the tower, it just led to what reminded Carl of the inside of a large elevator. And the whole group just got on board and began riding up. And then when this elevator of sorts came to a stop and the door opened again, Carl saw this small room with metal walls and a handful of what looked like platforms on the floor. Ozo-1 led the elk onto one of those platforms and told Carl to get on one too. And so Carl just did as he was told and stood on one of these platforms. And then out of nowhere, some kind of high-tech device emerged from these metallic walls and began sort of circling around Carl. It went from his head all the way to his toes, basically like scanning him. Carl was vaguely aware of the same process taking place to the elk as well. And then when this scanner was done, it made a beeping sound, and then Ozo-1 looked over at Carl and told him, well, the elk are what we needed, but you're not. So we're going to take you back to Earth now. And then Carl said the next thing he knew, he was just magically back inside of his work truck, like he had somehow been transported there instantaneously, and he was being shaken awake by those 2 sheriff's deputies. And so back in Dr. Sprinkle's office, Marjorie is listening, just completely shocked by what her husband is saying, not even sure what to make of it. And then Dr. Sprinkle, at the end of Carl's story, when he got to the point where he's being shaken awake by the deputies, Dr. Sprinkle snapped his finger, and Carl kind of came to. He opened his eyes and sort of refocused, clearly out of hypnosis. And then they all just kind of sat there, like in total silence, really unsure what to say to each other. But as crazy as Carl's story sounded, there were several very strange facts about Carl's case that, up to this point, nobody had been able to explain. And the story that Carl told while under hypnosis technically accounted for all of them. The first fact that this story explained was that when Carl woke up in his work truck, like magically just appeared in his work truck, it was not just 3 miles away from the main road, it was actually 3 miles away from where he had originally parked it. And this truck was just sitting in a muddy bog with no tire tracks leading up to it. So it was just totally unclear how it got there. And so if you follow along with Carl's story, perhaps when he was transported back to Earth, they, this other creature and the other humanoids maneuvered the truck with Carl in it into this bog. The second strange fact is that when Marjorie had ballistics experts analyze that flattened presumed bullet that she had found in Carl's jacket, they were just as baffled as she was. Like, they could not come up with any earthly explanation for how a bullet could be flattened and turned inside out. Like, this was not possible. And so again, if you follow Carl's story, perhaps this being is the one that flipped the bullet inside out. And the third and perhaps strangest fact is that when hospital doctors gave Carl x-rays, they found something that should have been medically impossible. All of the tuberculosis scar tissue in Carl's lungs that had plagued him for decades, that had made it so hard to be physical and exercise, they had somehow disappeared. It was as if someone or something had healed him. Despite how unbelievable Carl's story sounded, and despite the fact that hundreds of people have spent decades trying to disprove it, no one has ever found a better explanation for the moving truck, the impossible bullet, and Carl's disappearing scar tissue. Because of that, some researchers believe that Carl Higdon's account could be one of the most credible alien abduction stories ever recorded.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Lacasio. This episode was written by Karis Pash Cooper. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. On a day in 2001, a veteran homicide detective put on his gloves and stepped into a cluttered bedroom. He'd been working on a murder case for months, but he still had no clear evidence pointing to any of his suspects. However, a tip from an informant had led him to this bedroom, and he hoped he'd find something useful there. The detective searched the room, and at first, nothing stood out to him. That is, until he saw a piece of notebook paper sitting on a nightstand. On this paper was somebody's list of goals they wanted to accomplish in their life. The detective scanned the list. Most of the goals on the list were pretty standard, except for one, which was totally psychotic. But before we get into that story, If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please hide a tiny speaker in the ceiling of the Follow Button's bedroom and then play It's a Small World After All on repeat every time the Follow Button tries to fall asleep. Okay, let's get into today's story. Just after midnight on August 31st, 2001, 36-year-old Dana Laskowski sat on her couch sipping a drink at her home in Puyallup, Washington, which is about 35 miles outside of Seattle. Dana had been enjoying a night at home by herself, but as she sat there on the couch, the silence in the house started to feel a bit unsettling. It just was not something she'd gotten used to yet. Dana was the mother of 9-year-old triplets, so the house was typically filled with a lot of noise. But tonight, the kids were 3 hours away staying with their dad. Dana and her husband Stan had separated the previous year, and after the separation, Dana had moved several hours away to Puyallup, where some of her family lived. Dana and Stan had tried hard to effectively co-parent the triplets. She loved the idea. She loved that the kids still had a good relationship with their father, but not having them around all the time had been a huge transition for Dana. Dana grabbed the remote off the coffee table and turned on the TV, just to have some background noise. She sipped her drink and then kind of laughed at herself. Spending a night on her own really should not be that big of a deal. It should be fun, it should be enjoyable. And plus, even though her triplets would be gone for a few more days still, Dana worked as a nanny for a couple in town, and she'd be able to spend time with their kids, who she loved too. And so Dana told herself to just relax and enjoy a stress-free night. Then she leaned back on the couch and tried to watch TV. But as she was doing that, she suddenly heard this noise coming from the back of the house. She put her drink down, turned off the TV, and then walked out of the room towards the back door. She expected to see her 17-year-old niece and Amanda's best friend, Emily Lauenborg, standing in the hall, because Dana always kept her back door unlocked for these two teenage girls. Amanda and Emily both had strained relationships with their families, so Dana had become a kind of surrogate mother to both of them. She let them use her house to do laundry, take showers, or to just have a place they could come where they would feel taken care of. But when Dana reached the back of the house, she didn't see the girls standing in the hall. She walked to the back door and glanced outside onto the back porch, but she didn't see anybody there either. She figured she must be hearing things. Being home alone could do that after all. So she left the back door unlocked in case the girls did show up later, and then turned back around and headed back to the couch. Even though it was late, Dana suddenly thought about giving her niece a call, just to check in on her. The last time she'd seen Amanda and her friend Emily, they had been spending almost all their time with this group of teenage guys who called themselves the Park Rats, because they always hung around at the same public park. Dana tried to keep an open mind and not judge, but she couldn't help but worry about two young women spending time with a group of guys who did not seem to have any ambition in life. And she knew for a fact that some of the Park Rats had pretty serious drug problems. On top of that, Amanda and Emily were both relatively small girls, and Dana knew they really couldn't protect themselves if any of the guys ever tried to get physical with them. Dana sat down on the couch, still debating if she should call Amanda. However, before she could make up her mind, she heard something at the back door again. Then she heard footsteps coming down the hall. At 10:30 a.m. the following morning, a patrol officer from the Puyallup Police Department pulled up in front of Dana's house. He'd gotten a message from dispatch about an urgent 911 call that had come in that morning. A woman had called and said her children's nanny, Dana Laskowski, had not arrived at the house when she was supposed to. The woman and her husband had both called Dana, but couldn't get a hold of her. And this really worried them, because Dana would never not show up without calling and making sure the kids would be okay. So the woman had asked the police to please do a wellness check on Dana. The officer stepped out of his cruiser and glanced around the neighborhood. This was a pretty busy area of town, with lots of fast food restaurants and shops nearby, so the street could see plenty of traffic at night. The officer walked up to Dana's front door and knocked while calling out her name and also introducing himself. But after a few moments, he didn't get a response, and he also didn't hear any movement inside the house. And so eventually, the officer walked around to the side of the house and pressed his face against a window. However, the curtains inside the house made it difficult to see anything inside. So he walked around to the back of the house, and there he noticed the back door was cracked open. He slowly walked up the steps of the old wooden porch, approached the door, and then called out for Dana again through the crack. But there was still no response. The officer tensed up. He had no idea if this was an innocent mistake by Dana leaving the door open, or if maybe somebody had broken into her house. And if it was the latter, the intruder could still be inside. And so the officer unholstered his gun, pushed the door open, and stepped into the house. As he did this, he walked past an open door and glanced inside. It was a bedroom, and it looked like it had been ransacked. Dresser drawers were open and clothes had been thrown all over the floor, but he didn't see anybody in the room. And so the officer kept heading down the hallway, getting more and more tense as he moved. He eventually reached the front room and stepped inside. And there he found more pieces of clothing on the floor, but he still didn't see anybody. The officer reached for his radio, about to call in a potential burglary, when he looked over at the couch. And immediately, what he saw there told him he was dealing with something far worse than just a break-in. A little later that morning, veteran homicide detective Scott Bramhall of the Puyallup Police Department arrived at Dana's house. He saw a patrol officer standing out front, waiting for him. Bramhall could tell this officer was shaken up by what he'd found inside. Detective Bramhall talked to the officer and got as much information as he could, then he put on his gloves and stepped inside. Bramhall walked into the front room of the house and immediately saw what had upset the patrol officer. The dead body of a woman lay on the couch, with a blanket partially covering her legs, almost like she'd been keeping her feet warm. The patrol officer had found a photo ID during his search, and he had positively identified the woman as Dana Laskowski, the woman he had come to do the wellness check on. Detective Bramhall approached Dana's body and crouched down beside it. Right away, he saw specks of blood on her cheeks and mouth, as well as blood on the carpet by the couch. He also saw deep, dark bruises and ligature marks on Dana's throat. Bramhall looked around the room and saw a scarf on the floor not far from the couch. And his first thought was Dana had most likely been strangled to death, and that scarf could very well be the murder weapon. But the position Dana was lying in was by far the most shocking thing about this crime scene. Dana's head rested on one of her arms, but her other arm was bent at a strange angle behind her back, and her waist was twisted in an awkward position like her body was contorted. The result of all this was that even in death, Dana appeared like she was actively in some kind of physical struggle. Just then, the detective heard voices and footsteps behind him. He stood up and turned to see more police officers and a small group of forensic technicians walking into the room. Bramhall waved one of the forensic techs over, and the two of them began examining Dana's body together. The tech agreed that Dana had most likely been strangled to death, and the severity of the wounds on her throat indicated that whoever had killed her was pretty strong. Also, Detective Bramhall knew that in a lot of cases of strangulation, the victim fights back really aggressively, thrashing and fighting as much as they can, giving further credibility to the idea that Dana's killer really did have to be big and strong to be able to overpower her. After a few moments, Bramhall left the forensic tech and searched the rest of the house with a few other officers. He told a member of his team to get started on a background check for Dana, while other officers went out to speak with Dana's neighbors to see if any of them had seen or heard something strange that morning or the night before. As the detective made his way through Dana's house, it was clear the place had been ransacked. However, he noticed that some pretty obviously expensive items like a computer and other electronics had been left untouched. This could mean a couple of different things. Either someone had robbed Dana's house looking for something specific, like jewelry, or this entire scene had been staged to look like a robbery. Another thing that stood out to Bramhall was that even though Dana's body and the blood indicated a struggle, there was no sign of forced entry. The back door had been open and unlocked when the patrol officer had first arrived on the scene, and the front door had been locked and showed no signs of a break-in. So Bramhall wondered if Dana had let her killer inside, or if they had unlocked the back door with their own key. As Bramhall was searching the house, one of his team members came up to him. This officer told him that he'd only just started looking into Dana's background, but already he'd found something important. She and her husband Stan were recently separated, and Stan was not answering his phone. That night, after Detective Bramhall had spent hours at Dana's house, he got back to the police station, and he was already feeling antsy. Dana's husband, Stan, like any murder victim's spouse, would basically automatically be a major suspect under almost any circumstance. However, in the few hours since Bramhall had begun working this case, Stan had started to look like the perfect suspect. Stan had not responded to the multiple calls the Puyallup police had made throughout the day, and when Detective Bramhall had reached out to police in the town where Stan lived, they actually went by his house, and there had been no sign of Stan or the triplets. Now, Detective Bramhall did not want to jump to conclusions here. However, he couldn't ignore what might be going on here. A man killing his estranged wife so he could have sole custody of their kids was actually a fairly common thing. Still, Bramhall couldn't do anything until they actually tracked Stan down. So, the detective stayed in touch with the police in Stanstown, and he also contacted the Washington State Police to tell them to be on the lookout for Stan. In the meantime, Bramhall started to gather information on Dana's friends, family, and her employers. Now, he was already planning on interviewing everybody close to Dana, but if Stan didn't turn up soon, he hoped maybe one of them would be able to help police track him down. But the following morning, before Bramhall had met with anybody else, he got a phone call in his office. And as soon as he answered, he heard the voice of a man who sounded upset and a bit frightened. It was Dana's husband, Stan. Stan explained that he had just taken his kids camping and had been at a spot out in the woods that didn't get cell service. So when he'd left the campsite earlier that morning, he saw he had tons of voice messages from the police. And when he had called the cops back, he learned that his estranged wife had been murdered. And then after that, the police had connected him to Detective Bramhall. There was no question in Bramhall's mind that Stan was a major suspect. However, if Stan was innocent, Bramhall could not imagine a worse way to have gotten such horrific news. Bramhall told Stan they needed to talk right now in person, and so Bramhall said he would just drive over to Stan's house right now. Stan said okay, and so Detective Bramhall hung up and then told members of his team to begin looking into Dana's friends and family. Then Bramhall got in touch with the local police where Stan lived to say he was going there to interview him, and then he headed out. The 5-hour drive led Bramhall through the woods and hills of the Pacific Northwest, and as he drove, it hit Bramhall just how slow-going this trip really was. He wondered if Stan had gotten angry about having to make this drive just to see his kids. Maybe he'd gone to Dana's house and confronted her about it. If they'd gotten into a fight, Stan could have flown into a rage and killed her. Now, this was just a theory, but when Bramhall finally got to Stan's house along with a local officer and they met Stan at the front door, Bramhall's theory didn't seem too far-fetched. Because Stan was a big guy, he could have easily overpowered Dana. But more importantly, Bramhall noticed right away that Stan had scrape marks on both of his legs, a sign that perhaps he had a recent physical altercation with someone. Stan led Bramhall and the other officer into his house, and they all sat down together in the kitchen. Bramhall didn't waste any time. He asked Stan flat out if he and Dana had been arguing about their separation, and if that tension had led to any physical altercations. Stan immediately shook his head and said no. He didn't deny that he and Dana argued, and that being separated and trying to co-parent triplets could be stressful, but he said he and Dana had worked hard to help each other and to support each other, and to make their kids' lives as normal as possible. Bramhall immediately changed the subject, and asked Stan how he'd gotten those scrapes on his legs. Stan looked a little surprised by the question, but he said he'd gotten them while playing baseball. Bramhall jotted it down in his notebook, having no sense of whether or not he was actually getting the truth. Finally, Bramhall asked Stan if he'd be willing to submit a DNA sample. And at that, Stan's whole demeanor changed. He'd been cooperative the entire time, but now he said there was no way he was going to provide DNA. He still didn't really know what was going on here, and he hadn't even talked to a lawyer. Bramhall knew he couldn't force Stan to give them a DNA sample, not yet at least. He also knew a lot of people, even innocent people, didn't like the idea of providing their DNA. So Bramhall stood up, said he'd check into Stan's camping trip alibi, and that he'd be in touch. Hours later, Bramhall made it back to the station, and he felt like nothing had really changed regarding Stan. Stan was still a major suspect, and since he hadn't provided a DNA sample, the police would just have to keep digging into his alibi and his background to see if they could find anything that directly connected him to the murder. However, within minutes of getting back to the police station, one of Bramhall's team members came into his office and told him he had a major new lead. Detective Bramhall was worn out from all that driving he'd just done, but he felt an instant rush when he heard this. He asked the officer what he'd found. The officer said he'd spoken to the couple who employed Dana as their nanny, and they said Dana had a stalker, a guy named William. And Dana had even said to her employers that if she ever turned up dead, William would be the one who had killed her. On the evening of September 2nd, 2 days after Dana's body had been found, Detective Bramhall sat inside of an interview room across the table from Dana's alleged stalker, William. It would turn out William had installed cabling at Dana's house a few months earlier. And since then, he'd been leaving notes and poems on Dana's front door, and he'd been seen lurking around her house a bunch of times by several of Dana's neighbors. Police also found a string of harassing messages from William on Dana's phone. And so all of that had been enough for Bramhall to secure a search warrant, and the search of William's house had led to a disturbing discovery. Inside the interview room, Detective Bramhall pulled out a notebook and put it on the table. Then he asked William if he recognized it. William lowered his head and then nodded. He said it was his personal journal. Bramhall flipped open the notebook and showed William what appeared to be a letter to an unnamed woman. And this letter was filled with all these violent things William wanted to do to her. Bramhall flipped to another page, which was another letter to this same unnamed woman, filled with even more anger and more threats of violence. And so Detective Bramhall said it looked to him like William had been obsessed with Dana, leaving her notes and poetry and spying on her at her house. And when Dana didn't reciprocate, he got angry and started fantasizing about hurting her and began writing about it in his journal. But as William heard this, he just shook his head and said, no, it's not like that at all. William said those letters were an exercise his therapist had told him to do, and they weren't even about Dana. He said he had written that stuff about a woman who'd broken his heart, but it was just to get out the anger and hurt that he felt. He would never actually do any of the stuff he had written. Bramhall sat there in silence for a minute, just looking at the man across the table. Like Dana's husband, William was easily big enough to have overpowered Dana. And even if William was telling the truth about the notebook, he clearly had some kind of unhealthy obsession with Dana. So Bramhall leaned in and told William there was a really easy way for him to clear his name and help the police figure out what happened to Dana. William could provide the police with his phone and a DNA sample. And William didn't hesitate. He said he would do whatever the police needed, anything that would show he did not hurt Dana. In the days following the interview with William, Detective Bramhall and his team met with more of Dana's friends and family. Bramhall had two solid suspects, Stan, the estranged husband, and William the stalker. But he still didn't have any clear evidence pointing to either of them. And most of the people he spoke to didn't provide much more information. But Bramhall eventually met with Dana's 17-year-old niece Amanda at her house, and she told him something that had the potential to turn his whole investigation on its head. Amanda told Bramhall that Dana was like a second mother to her and her best friend Emily. Dana let them come over whenever they wanted, and the house was like this great escape for them. Amanda said Dana even left her back door unlocked, just so they could come in whenever they wanted to. This was a huge piece of news for Bramhall. It now made sense how somebody could have gotten into Dana's house without actually having to break in. They just walked in the unlocked back door. But then Amanda said something else that seemed even bigger. She explained that she and Emily had become friends with a bunch of teenagers who called themselves the Park Rats. And Bramhall knew exactly who they were, and he knew some of them were bad news. More than a few Park Rats had ended up in jail for drugs and violent crimes. And so as soon as Bramhall heard this, he asked Amanda if any of the Park Rats knew that her aunt kept her back door unlocked. And Amanda nodded and said yes. She said she had actually brought a couple of the Park Rats to Dana's house to meet her, just because Amanda thought Dana was so good at taking care of people who didn't really have anybody else. And most of the Park Rats had very difficult home lives. Detective Bramhall left Amanda's house and laid out his next steps. So far, his case had seemed like a pretty straightforward case. Estranged husbands and stalkers were common suspects. But now, he and his team were going to have to track down and interrogate a local gang of teenagers. Finding the Park Rats didn't prove to be too difficult for Detective Bramhall. A few trips to the public park where they hung out, and meeting with a couple members of the group who were now in jail was really all it took. But getting the Park Rats to actually give him useful information turned out to be a lot harder. Most of them said they knew about Dana's murder, but all of them denied having anything to do with it. And since Bramhall didn't have any evidence connecting these teenagers to the scene, he couldn't just arrest them and try to force them to talk. And so before long, a month had just flown by, and Bramhall still didn't have anything. And in that time, no new evidence surfaced that pointed to either Dana's husband Stan or the stalker William. And so Bramhall began to worry that maybe Dana's death had been the result of a random burglary gone wrong, and that the police were not even close to tracking down her killer. On October 4th, 2001, so 34 days after Dana's murder, her friends and family finally gathered for her funeral. Because of the ongoing investigation, police had waited longer than usual to release the body back to the family. But now, a funeral home in town was packed with people who had come to express how much they loved and missed Dana, and how much she had been there for them. Detective Bramhall and some members of his team attended the funeral, watching to see if anyone might do something that jumped out at them. But nothing out of the ordinary happened. It was just a group of people grieving the loss of a loved one. After the service was over, Bramhall secured the funeral memorial book, which had been signed by the people who had attended. Bramhall hoped that he could find someone in this book that could maybe offer his investigation a new lead. So Bramhall and his team brought the book back to the station and they went through it, and as they did, they saw some people, in addition to signing it, also left written notes. And one of these written notes totally floored Bramhall. After reading the note several times, Bramhall felt confident he had just found a massive clue. Bramhall and his team quickly met with the person who had written this note, and what that person said led police right back to the Park Rats. Over the next several weeks, armed with new information from this memorial book, Detective Bramhall tracked down several of the Park Rats he'd already met with, and they were willing to cooperate. All of them still maintained they had nothing to do with Dana's murder, but they said there was somebody the police needed to talk to. It was someone they all knew, and who they called the Mutant. Bramhall thought the Mutant definitely sounded like a nickname a group of teenagers would come up with, like something out of a comic book. But the Park Rats said the Mutant was more like a name for a professional wrestler, because the Mutant was really strong and loved to wrestle. And like all professional wrestlers, the Mutant had a signature move: choking their opponent, twisting them at the waist, and bending their arm all the way behind their back. When Detective Bramhall heard about this signature wrestling move, immediately images of the bizarre position he'd found Dana's body in ran through his mind. And so, the detective and his team spent the next several days compiling background information, and then they brought the Mutant in for an interview. And by the end of that interview, Detective Bramhall knew who had killed Dana Laskowski. Based on information from the Mutant, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Dana not long after midnight on August 31st, 2001. That night, the killer and their partner moved quietly through the darkness towards the back door of Dana's house. Once they got there, they opened it up, walked inside, and began walking down the hallway towards the front room. When they got there, they saw Dana standing by the couch. But before she could say anything, the killer demanded that Dana give them some money. Dana stayed calm and said she was sorry but didn't have any money, but the killer immediately snapped back and said Dana needed to hand over some cash right now. Dana repeated that she didn't have any money, and then she asked the killer and their partner to please just leave, but the killer wasn't having it. They walked over to Dana, they grabbed her and shouted that they wanted her money now. Dana tried to push the killer off, but the killer was too strong. Dana screamed, and this only set off the killer even more. They hit Dana in the face and then slammed her to the floor. Dana tried to get up off the floor, but the killer just leapt on top of her and rolled her over onto her stomach. Then the killer saw one of Dana's scarves laying on the arm of the couch, and they grabbed it. Then, before Dana could do anything, they wrapped that scarf around Dana's neck and began choking her. Dana kicked and flailed, but the killer fought off her attack, while the killer's partner just stood there, watching. The killer kept choking Dana with the scarf in one hand, and then with their other hand, they grabbed Dana's arm and they yanked it violently backwards, twisting her around at the waist. Dana tried to scream louder, but now she was gasping for air, and slowly Dana's eyes went wide and she stopped breathing, and she died right there on the floor. The killer let go of the scarf and Dana's arm, and they stood up. They stared down at Dana's body, and then over at their partner, who was still just standing there in a daze. Then the killer picked Dana up. The scarf fell to the floor as the killer laid Dana on the couch, still in her twisted position with her arm pinned behind her back. The killer then grabbed a folded-up blanket from the edge of the couch and covered Dana's feet and part of her legs with it, almost like they were tucking her in. But after the killer stepped away from the couch and kind of surveyed the scene, it was like they began to panic. They yelled at their partner that they needed to make this look like a robbery. The two of them quickly ran to Dana's bedroom and threw open all the drawers and littered the floor with clothing. They also carried some more clothes into the front room and dumped those on the floor as well. And then they ran out of the room, down the hall, and out the back door. The same back door that Dana had always left unlocked just for them, so they could always come to her house to escape their troubles at home. The people responsible for Dana's murder were Dana's own niece, Amanda, and Amanda's best friend, Emily Lauenborg, who all of the park rats knew as the Mutant. The two young women had gone to Dana's house to try to get Dana to give them some money, and when she refused, it was Emily, the Mutant, who attacked and killed her. Emily had not been high on the suspect list because on the surface, she did not fit the profile of the killer. Police had assumed that the killer was a man who was bigger and stronger than Dana, and Emily was a small young woman who was only about 5'2". But it would turn out, despite her small size, Emily was extremely strong and loved to wrestle, hence how she got the nickname the Mutant. The note that Detective Bramhall saw in Dana's funeral memorial book that really stood out to him was written by Dana's niece, Amanda. And it read, "I'm sorry I wasn't a better niece for you. 34 days clean and sober. It's all for you." The funeral was held exactly 34 days after Dana's murder, suggesting Dana's murder prompted Amanda to go sober on that same day. Now, that in and of itself is not totally unreasonable that a death in the family would prompt a big life change. However, to Bramhall, as he was reading through the notes, that note just felt weirdly specific to reference her sobriety and the exact number of days inside of this memorial book when all the other notes were just far less specific. And so to him, something felt off about it. And so the detective followed up with Amanda and asked her about the note, and she would admit to him that she had been struggling with drug addiction. And so Bramhall wanted to know if her sudden sobriety was connected to Dana's murder, like the note implied. And Amanda would say yes, And over the course of this discussion, she would also just tell Bramhall that there was this drug dealer in the park rats who might have killed her aunt. However, when Bramhall met with that drug dealer and several other members of the park rats, they all pointed the finger at Emily, the mutant. Police searched Emily's house and found a piece of paper in her room. On it, she had written a list of goals she had. And one of those goals was to, quote, kill someone and get away with it. Emily eventually confessed to the murder, and Amanda admitted to being in the house during the murder. Dana's niece Amanda aided the police in prosecution, and so she was not charged with any crime. As for Emily, she would take a plea deal and would only serve about 5.5 years in prison. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. This podcast, the MrBallen podcast, and also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, and Redacted. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts to find all of these shows. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature 2 stories that show we may not be alone in this universe. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Flying Solo, and it's about an Australian pilot who vanishes over a strange area in a very bizarre series of events. And the second and final story you'll hear is called It Hovers, and it's about one of the most credible paranormal stories we've ever covered. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 4 times a week: Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Fridays. So if that's of interest to you, please replace the follow button stick deodorant with cream cheese. Okay, let's get into our first story called Flying Solo. At 7 p.m. on October 21st, 1978, a 20-year-old pilot named Frederick Valentik flew his small plane over a body of water just south of Australia called the Bass Strait. He'd just taken off from Melbourne, Australia, and his flight plan was to go 60 miles south to an island called King Island, and he was really excited about this flight. Not so much about where he was going, but because this represented the first time he'd actually be flying by himself at night. So Frederick had always dreamed of becoming a pilot, but the journey to actually becoming one had been really difficult. He had applied twice, actually, to the Royal Australian Air Force, but unfortunately he could not meet their requirements. And then also he had tried to become a commercial airline pilot, but he had failed their tests. But luckily for Frederick, his father had a ton of money, and he ultimately swooped in and funded Frederick to take some private lessons, and through that he was able to ultimately pass the tests and get his pilot's license. And so, as Frederick coasted along, looking down below at the lights of Melbourne disappearing behind him, he felt like he was on top of the world. He was doing the one thing he had always dreamed of, and he was so happy, and it was so cool to be doing it at night by himself. And so he was just looking out at the sights and looking ahead at the Bass Strait, which is this huge, dark expanse of water, and it was like everything was right in the world. He was doing exactly what he wanted to do. However, only a few minutes into this flight, at 7:06 p.m., something strange happened. As Frederick was flying along, he suddenly became aware of a light coming from somewhere behind him.
Remember, it's nighttime, so it's totally dark where he is, and he's flying over a body of water, so he's kind of like in this void of darkness. And so any lights are really going to illuminate the cockpit. And so he sees this light, he turns around, and maybe 3,000 or 4,000 feet behind him, he sees what looks like a plane. That is the source of the light. And right away, Frederick's thinking that is both surprising and also potentially very problematic, because he knew from his training that that was far too close to be to another plane. And so the only explanation was either that pilot was off course or Frederick was off course. And Frederick's thinking, if I'm off course here and I'm flying where I shouldn't be, I'm going to get in trouble with air traffic control and I might lose my pilot's license. Like the one thing I covet, I might lose it. And so initially, Frederick really didn't know what to do. He was sort of panicking and just kind of frozen, like, I don't even know what I'm supposed to do right now. And as this was happening, Frederick kept instinctively looking back at this light, trying to figure out what this plane was doing. And every time he would turn around over the course of just a few seconds, it was very obvious that this light, this other plane, was gaining on him. And so Frederick starts to worry, like, this is not just about maybe getting in trouble or not. This plane might crash into me. Look how fast they're going. Like, what do I do? And so Frederick, at this point, he double checked that he was on course. And based on his instruments and what he had been doing, he really felt like he was on course here. And he just thinks, you know what? The best thing I can do here is just call air traffic control. So he grabs the radio and he gets a hold of Melbourne Air Traffic Control and he says, hey, there's this plane that is like right behind me. They're gaining on me. I'm worried they're going to crash into me. Do I need to deviate? Like, what's going on here? And the air traffic controller very calmly says, okay, let me check the radar. Let me check the schedules. And so Frederick, the whole time he's waiting for a response, he's looking over his shoulder and still this light is gaining on him. It's getting closer and closer. And then finally, the controller gets back on the radio and they tell Frederick, there is no other aircraft anywhere near you. Like there's nothing over the Bass Strait. You are completely alone. But Frederick couldn't believe this because by now, the light, the aircraft that was right behind him has gotten right behind his. It's basically right on his tail. And Frederick is now completely panicked and he's getting ready to try to explain, like, no, wait a minute, like there's gotta be a better explanation here. There's something right here. But at that very moment, it becomes very clear to Frederick that this is not some ordinary aircraft, because it began doing something when it got right up behind his aircraft that no normal aircraft could do. This light suddenly began orbiting Frederick's aircraft. Frederick is traveling forward, and this ball of light is basically whipping around his aircraft. He can barely make it out. He's starting to panic, and at the same time, Frederick begins to hear the sound of his engine starting to fail. And there was no reason for it. His craft was fine when he took off, but now it's clearly sputtering and failing. And so all Frederick could do in this totally intense, panicked moment is just grab the radio and begin talking to air traffic control about what he was seeing. The person Frederick actually spoke to on the ground in this moment was an air traffic controller in Melbourne named Steve Roby. And Frederick would come off to Steve like he was totally crazy and unhinged, and Steve would say that he couldn't really understand what he was talking about. But at some point, Frederick clearly began talking about some sort of craft orbiting his own, and that his engine was starting to fail and he didn't know what was going to happen and he couldn't make an emergency landing. He was over water. And then suddenly Steve remembers hearing this grinding metallic sound come over the radio that basically washed out whatever Frederick was saying. And then it just goes deadly silent. And after that, Frederick disappeared. They searched the area where they knew he was before he disappeared, but they never found his plane. There was no sign of a crash. He never landed at King Island or went back to Melbourne. He was just gone. All they have is that final recording of him describing something orbiting him, then this grinding metallic sound, and then silence. And recently, that audio recording was made public. Here is the official explanation for what happened to Frederick. As he was flying over the Bass Strait, it was so dark and there were no lights really anywhere that at some point, because he's an inexperienced pilot, I suppose, he flipped his plane upside down without realizing it, and the light that he was seeing was actually just a reflection off the water below of his own plane. And eventually, from flying upside down, his engine began to fail and he crashed into the Bass Strait. However, not everybody believes this explanation. Because one, it seems sort of preposterous to imagine that Frederick would not have realized he had flipped the plane upside down and was flying for so long inverted. Like, how could you not notice that? And two, this would not be the first time that somebody reported unexplained phenomena over the Bass Strait. In fact, over the years leading up to this incident with Frederick, there had been so many reports of UFOs flying over the Bass Strait and also unexplained disappearances that they've dubbed the Bass Strait the Bass Strait Triangle. after the Bermuda Triangle. Basically, it's a part of the world where a disproportionate number of unexplained phenomena occur. And so to this day, Frederick's disappearance remains a mystery. The next and final story of today's episode is called It Hovers. Around 9 p.m. on December 29, 1980, a 57-year-old woman named Vicki Landrum rode in the front seat of her friend Betty Cash's car, while her 7-year-old grandson named Colby, who she was raising, sat between them. The three of them had just had dinner at a truck stop and were now on their way home, driving down a dark wooded highway near Huffman, Texas, which is a small town about 30 miles northeast of Houston. As they drove down the road, Vicki began to notice the windshield was fogging up from how cold it was outside and how warm it was inside the car. And so Vicki turned on the defroster. And as the windshield began to clear, Vicki noticed this bright light right out in front of them up over the trees. And at first, Vicki just figured, they were close to the Houston airport, and so that light must just be an airplane. But as the trio continued driving down this winding highway road, that light that Vicki really thought was a plane landing appeared to just kind of hover in the trees, and actually, as they drove, the light almost appeared to get closer and closer to them, so it didn't really seem like it was a plane. Now, at first, Vicki thought this was just kind of interesting and was curious about this light. But as they got closer and closer to this light, it became very obvious that the inside of the car was getting much warmer and stuffier than any of the heat settings would allow it to get, to the point where Vicki was actually sweating and panting from the heat. Now, all of this was happening really quickly, and so Vicki sort of went from being curious to being kind of anxious. Like, what was going on here? Like, does this light have something to do with the heat they're experiencing in the car? And then all of a sudden, the light that appeared to be sort of behind the trees suddenly came right out in front of the car, and Vicki screamed at Betty, "Stop!" And Becky jammed on the brakes, and they came to a stop, and blocking their path maybe 100 feet in front of them, just hovering over the road, is this strange-looking aircraft aimed right at them. This craft was the strange light. For a moment, all three of them just stared in shock at this craft, like it was so unexpected and so unbelievable that this had happened. But then Vicki, who's sitting there still panting and sweating, she's looking out and she's realizing this craft she's looking at looks nothing like any other aircraft she had ever seen. The craft was a bit bigger than a car, it was diamond-shaped, and it was letting out these strange, loud roaring sounds, almost like an engine. It appeared to be glowing red hot, and periodically, with those loud roaring sounds it was making, fire would appear to shoot out the bottom of the craft, scorching the pavement right under it. And again, this strange craft is just hovering there, right over the ground, appeared to be aimed directly at Vicki, Betty, and Colby. Pretty quickly, Colby began to cry. He was scared. But Betty, the driver, she said she couldn't go anywhere. The road was too thin. She couldn't really turn around very easily, and she couldn't drive straight and go under the craft and risk being burned by the flames. And so they were just kind of trapped there. And so Vicki and Betty sort of looked at each other like, okay, we're just gonna wait it out and hope this craft just eventually flies away. But after several minutes, and the craft still had not departed, it was still blocking their way and periodically spitting fire into the ground, Vicki and Betty are like, well, let's get out and see what's going on here. Let's investigate. By this point, their fear and anxiety around this had sort of been replaced by just genuine human curiosity. I mean, what the heck is this thing? And so Betty, the driver, she gets out, and Vicki, she tells her grandson, stay in the car, so Colby's right here, and Vicki gets out, and the second she does, and she now has an unobstructed view at this craft, she suddenly remembered this Bible verse. So Vicki was very religious, and she had read in the Bible that one day Jesus would return to the earth, and when he did, he would return in a rain of fire. And so all of a sudden, Vicki believed that what she was looking at was not some aircraft, but the second coming of Jesus Christ. This was like a highly spiritual moment for her. But just as Vicki was about to go forward and actually inspect this thing up close, she heard Colby call out for her. He was crying hysterically. He was totally scared and upset. And so this kind of broke Vicki out of her trance. She turned around and went back to the car to comfort Colby. And when she got back to the car, she found Colby scrunched up on the floor underneath the dashboard like he was trying to shield himself from this craft. And so Vicki, she got right down there with him. She wrapped her arms around Colby and began praying with him to try to calm him down. But while Vicki and Colby were praying inside the car, Betty remained outside of the car, just staring at this craft. And it went on like this for about 10 minutes until Vicki, who's still tucked down there with Colby, heard that roaring sound coming from the aircraft get noticeably louder, like it was about to do something. And so Vicky poked her head up and she looked out the windshield, and sure enough, this craft was beginning to take off. It was getting higher and higher off the ground. Flames were shooting out the bottom of it. Betty was still outside staring at it. And then before long, this craft had shot straight up into the air and began taking off up and away from them at a really steep angle. And at the same time, Vicky suddenly saw this swarm of all these helicopters, these military-style helicopters, go right up around this craft like they were escorting it. And then the craft and all these helicopters took off into the horizon and disappeared. After they were all gone, Vicky realized that what she had just witnessed was not the second coming of Christ. Because of these military helicopters that arrived as this craft took off, it told Vicky and also Betty that very likely this was just a US military exercise of some sort. And so a few moments later, Betty came back to the car and sat in the driver's seat, and Vicky, she climbed back into her seat and lifted Colby up to the middle seat as well. And for a moment, the three of them just sat there in silence. I mean, there's nothing blocking their way anymore. They're just sort of trying to process what just happened. Eventually, Betty just put the car in drive and began driving straight ahead, crossing right over that scorch mark on the pavement where the craft had been. About 45 minutes later, Betty pulled up to Vicky's house and parked the car. Vicky and Colby, they got out, they said goodbye to Betty. They didn't really talk about what they had just seen, they just said goodnight, and then Vicky and Colby headed inside the house. And as much as both of them did have things to say about whatever it was they saw, they just continued not to talk about it. They both were just kind of eager to go to bed. However, as Vicky was putting Colby to bed, he began to complain that his stomach hurt, and at the same time, Vicky began to realize that she also didn't feel very well. And shortly after that, both of them were vomiting in the bathroom. And this scared Vicky. She tried to tell herself that, maybe the reason they were sick is because they ate some bad food at that truck stop. But deep down, Vicky was very concerned that their nausea was somehow connected to that strange craft. And so it was a very long night, with Vicky and Colby being nauseous most of the time, but eventually they both did fall asleep. And then when Vicky got up the next morning, she still felt awful. And so Vicky, she rolled out of bed and made her way to the bathroom, and when she looked at herself in the mirror, she gasped. Her skin was bright red and blistered, like she had had this horrible sunburn. At this point, she knew whatever was going on here, it had to do with that craft. She just knew it. And so Vicky instinctively rushed to Colby's room to check on him to see if his skin was all blistered and red, and she found he was still sleeping, but she could see his skin was red and blistered in some places, but not nearly as bad as Vicky's. And so Vicky, she began thinking about the night before, and she remembered she had gotten out of the car and gotten closer to the craft. So she was sort of more exposed to the craft, if you will, than Colby, who stayed in the car and tucked himself down underneath the dashboard the whole time. And so maybe Vicky's exposure to the craft was higher than Colby's, which is why she looked worse. But as Vicky was thinking this through, she remembered that Betty had actually stayed outside the car for 10-15 minutes, much longer than Vicky had, the whole time just staring directly at this craft. And so immediately Vicky was worried that, if this is what happened to me, I can only imagine what shape Betty is in. And so Vicky ran to the phone, she picked it up and she dialed Betty's number, and she listened, and it just kept on ringing and ringing. Betty didn't answer. Now, at this point, Vicky was in a full-blown panic. Not only because she was worried about Betty, but also, she doesn't really know what's wrong with her or with Colby. She doesn't know if their sickness is going to get worse or better. Currently, she felt horrible. She was nauseous. Her skin seemed to be practically falling off. Colby was in less bad shape, but still not healthy. And also, Vicky didn't have the money to even go to the doctor to get looked at. And so as much as Vicky really wanted right now to just go check on Betty, go drive to her house and check on her, she couldn't. She needed to focus on herself and her grandson first and make sure they were okay before she did anything else. And so over the next few days, Vicky and Colby stayed home, they slowly regained their strength, and over those few days, Vicky actually would get Betty on the phone. And Betty would tell her that yes, she's also dealing with similar symptoms, but she was okay, which was very reassuring to Vicky. However, Vicky also knew that Betty was not a complainer, and even if she did have horrendous symptoms, she was not the type of person who would necessarily tell Vicky. She would sort of tough it out. Finally, after 5 days, Vicky felt strong enough to go check on Betty in person. However, when she got to Betty's house and went inside, she called out for Betty, but there was no answer. The house was eerily quiet. And so Vicky began walking around Betty's house looking for Betty, and eventually Vicky walked down a hallway and reached Betty's bedroom, and the door was shut. Vicky called out for Betty, but there was no answer from inside. And so feeling kind of scared at this point, Vicky reached down, she turned the handle and opened the door, and immediately she saw Betty on her bed, and Betty looked horrible.
She was barely conscious. Her entire body was red and blistered and bleeding. There was vomit all over the bed sheets, and there were all these huge clumps of Betty's hair littering her pillow. And so Vicky was horrified. She rushed inside, she scooped her friend up, and between the two of them, they kind of hobbled out of the house. Vicky put Betty in her car, and they sped to the hospital. A few hours later, Vicky was waiting in the emergency room where Betty was being treated when Betty's doctor walked into the waiting room, at which point Vicky stood up and rushed over to him and said, "Hey, what's going on with Betty? What happened to her? What's going on?" But the doctor just shook his head and said, your friend, her skin is literally peeling off her face in sheets, and there are blisters breaking out all over her body. He told Vicky that her symptoms reminded him of radiation poisoning. However, he also told Vicky that that was basically impossible. For Betty, a woman who lives in rural Texas, where would she go to come in contact with something that radioactive? It just seemed not possible, so that couldn't be it. But Vicky, when she heard this, felt like she knew exactly how Betty came in contact with something highly radioactive. It had to be that craft. And so without even thinking about it, Vicky began pouring out the story of how her and Betty had seen this light, and then this craft appeared on the road, and it was shooting fire, and then it flew off with helicopters all around it. But as she was wrapping up her story, Vicky was suddenly overcome with embarrassment because the doctor was now staring at her like she was totally out of her mind. A month later, in early February of 1981, Vicky was at her kitchen table with the phone pressed to her ear. She was calling her local senator, who she'd already written to try to tell him about this strange aircraft she had seen that made her friend sick. But Vicky did not have high hopes about this phone call, because she had already been ignored so many times by so many people when it came to this story. So by this point, Vicky and her grandson Colby had basically recovered from their nausea and their burns. However, Betty had not recovered. She was still cycling in and out of the hospital, she was in constant pain, she still had burns all over her, and in fact, because of all these symptoms, she'd had to move in with her brother. Now, Vicky was certain that all these symptoms Betty had were radiation sickness caused by the radiation from this aircraft they came in contact with, but it was like everybody they told about this aircraft didn't believe them. Just then, Vicky heard a woman's voice break through the hold music. It was the local senator's secretary. And so Vicky quickly explained why she was calling and why she really wanted to talk to the local senator, but the secretary just told Vicky that, yep, she'll pass this along to the senator and he'll be in touch. And then she hung up. And for Vicky, this was the moment she snapped. She felt like trying to navigate the proper channels to try to figure out what this aircraft was and what happened to Betty was not working because clearly nobody was taking her seriously. And so Vicky slammed the phone down and just sat there frustrated, having no idea what to do. But as she sat there, Vicky remembered there was actually one place she had not called yet, specifically because she didn't want to call this place. It was a UFO research center. And Vicky hadn't called because she did not believe the craft she had seen was a UFO. She believed it was a military aircraft because she had seen the helicopters escorting it away, and that made the most sense. It had to be military. But if she called the UFO Research Center and people found out about that, it would make her look even crazier because now she's claiming the craft was aliens or something. But now Vicky felt like she had run out of options. So she picked up the phone, grabbed the piece of paper with the number on it, and dialed. A couple days later, a scientist named John Schuessler drove down the winding wooded highway into Huffman, Texas. He was going to meet up with Vicky. John was an aerospace engineer for NASA. However, he also spent a lot of time investigating UFO sightings. Vicky's call to that UFO research center had created a lot of excitement in the UFO community, and the story had eventually found its way to John, who decided he would take on the case. Now, to be clear, John was not into researching UFO sightings in order to prove they really happened. Actually, it was sort of the opposite. He would look into reported UFO sightings in order to prove they were not UFOs. He would find a rational, scientific explanation that debunked the sighting. That's sort of what he did. And so with Vicky's case, that was his intention, to go to Huffman, Texas, talk to Vicky, and explain away with science and rationale what happened here. That this was not, aliens. This was something ordinary, like a government aircraft. And so John eventually got to Vicky's house and he went inside and he chatted with Vicky and she talked him through all the details of the story. And then eventually they both left Vicky's house, they hopped in their respective cars and headed out to go to the actual site where this had happened. And when they got there, and John got out of the car, he didn't need Vicky to direct him to the specific site, because right in front of him was this really obvious black circle right in the middle of the road, as if the road itself had been melted and then re-solidified and actually looked different. And Vicky said that's where it was. That's where the craft was hovering. Those marks are from the craft. Now, this was great evidence that a craft really had been here, but John wanted more. He needed to figure out what kind of craft this really was. And so he told Vicky he was going to leave and go canvass the area for witnesses, and he told her he would keep her updated. So Vicky left, and John drove up the road until he reached some campsites and farmhouses. And John systematically went from door to door and tent to tent, asking anybody if they had seen or heard any aircraft or anything strange on the night of December 29th. Now, going into this, John didn't really know what to expect from these people he was asking. I mean, he's some random scientist showing up uninvited at people's homes, asking if they've seen strange lights in the sky. However, every single person he spoke to said that yes, they had seen that aircraft on December 29th. However, they were obviously just farther away than Vicky and Betty and Colby had been. So now, John felt like he had enough information to speak directly with military officials. However, when he contacted all the military bases in the area, all those officials he spoke to told him absolutely that on December 29th, there were 0 military operations happening. John found this very frustrating because to him, it seemed very clear that these officials were just lying to him. But what they were lying about and why was unclear. So John actually went to these military bases to speak to the officials face to face. And when he did, he showed them all the witness testimonies saying what they had seen on December 29th. And he also told them that with his own eyes, he had seen the black scorched mark on the pavement, where the pavement seemed to have literally melted in a ring and re-solidified from the heat of this craft. And to John, I mean, that scorch mark almost proved something had been there, very likely a military craft. But all these military leaders, despite hearing this and hearing John's testimony, they just said, you know what, you can gather up all the evidence you think you have here, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't prove that we were in the area. There was no military craft there that night. And so the bottom line was, the military was adamant they were not involved. And so the case really began to stall. John went home, but he couldn't stop thinking about the case, and so he kept in touch with his witnesses and periodically checked in with military officials, but nothing seemed to change, except that Betty continued to get sicker and sicker, and Vicky actually began to develop other serious symptoms, like developing cataracts in one of her eyes. And then John got a frantic call from one of his witnesses. They told him they had just seen something truly incredible. And as John listened to the story, he felt his heart sink, because now he knew the military had been lying to him about being out there on December 29th. Clearly they had been, and very likely it was their aircraft that had made Betty, Vicky, and Colby so sick. But now, John also knew that any hope he had of proving this was now literally gone, because the witness told him that black government vehicles had rolled up to the incident site out on that road, and they'd come along with construction vehicles, and for no clear traffic-related reason, they had cut up one particular stretch of that road, taken it with them, and left. And that particular stretch of road that was removed just happened to be the exact spot where that scorch mark had been left by the craft. It was like they were taking the evidence and getting rid of it. Now, John himself was not able to literally go back to the road and see for himself where the pavement had been cut. However, not long after John learned this information, a group of UFO scientists descended on the road to find this scorch mark, or to prove it had been cut out and taken away like the witness had said. And sure enough, when they got out there, they didn't find the scorch mark. Instead, they found nice, fresh, brand new pavement. The strange event that Vicky, Betty, and Colby experienced on the night of December 29, 1980, is widely considered to be one of the most famous and credible UFO sightings of all time. It's now known as the Cache Landrum incident, after Betty and Vicky's last names, and to this day, nobody has been able to come up with a rational explanation for what happened if it wasn't a UFO. To this day, the US government maintains that they did not have any military operations happening on December 29th. However, they did say when it comes to cutting out the road and paving over it, that that was just for routine maintenance. They were not trying to hide evidence. As for Vicky and Betty, over the years, their health continued to deteriorate. They ultimately filed a lawsuit against the government, but because they couldn't actually prove that the aircraft even existed or that it caused their health problems, their lawsuit was ultimately dismissed. Both women would eventually die from cancer, which Colby believes is a direct result from radiation exposure. As for Colby, he's still alive and continuing to seek answers. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Lacasio. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Minata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.